In 1957, in the quiet, hard-working town of Akron, Ohio, a 31-year-old man named Larry Bader was trying his best to build a good life. He had a wife, Mary Lou, and 3 young kids who were his entire world. By all accounts, Larry was a wonderful father and a loving husband. He was the kind of guy who would do anything for his family. But there was one area where Larry consistently struggled, and that was business. He had the heart of an entrepreneur, always brimming with new ideas and big dreams. Over the years, he had poured his energy and what little money they had into one venture after another. But each one, for one reason or another, had failed to take off. These failures left the Bader family in a deep hole of debt. And so, Larry had to put his entrepreneurial dreams on the shelf. He couldn't afford to take any more risks. He needed a steady paycheck to keep a roof over his family's head and food on the table. He took a job as a cookware salesman for a local company. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't his passion, but it paid the bills. The work was a daily reminder of his failed ambitions, and it wore on him. To escape the pressure and the quiet disappointment of his life, Larry had found a sanctuary. That sanctuary was Lake Erie, about an hour's drive north of their home. On the weekends, if Mary Lou was okay with managing the kids on her own, Larry would pack up his gear and his small boat and just disappear. Out on the water with a fishing line in his hand, he could disconnect from the bills, from the sales quotas, and from the life he felt he was supposed to be living. It was his way of resetting, of finding a small piece of peace. On Friday, the 15th of March, 1957, Larry came to his wife with his usual weekend request. He told her he really needed to get away, to head up to the lake and do some fishing. Mary Lou, as always, was supportive. She knew how much he needed these trips. But this time, she was worried. She told him she had heard the weather forecast, and it wasn't good. A big storm was supposed to roll in over the lake. She asked him if he was sure it was a good idea to go. Larry just smiled and waved it off. He told her not to worry, that the news always exaggerated these things. He said the storms were never as bad as they predicted, and he would be perfectly fine. And so, with that reassurance, he kissed Mary Lou goodbye, he kissed each of his 3 children, grabbed his fishing gear, and headed out the door. He hopped in his truck and drove north towards the calm, gray waters of Lake Erie. That night, the storm that Mary Lou had worried about crashed down on Lake Erie with a vengeance. It was far worse than anyone had predicted. The winds howled, and the rain came down in sheets, turning the lake's surface into a violent, churning mess. The following morning, as the storm began to subside, the Coast Guard was out on patrol, surveying the damage. And that's when they found it. A small boat, bobbing aimlessly in the waves. It was Larry Bader's boat. They pulled up alongside it and saw that it had some minor damage, like it had been battered around by the storm. One of the oars was missing. And so was Larry. A massive search was launched immediately. The Coast Guard scoured the lake and the shoreline for days, hoping to find any sign of him. But there was nothing. Larry Bader had simply vanished into the storm. After weeks of searching turned up no body and no new clues, the authorities had to make a difficult call. Larry Bader was officially declared dead, lost to the unforgiving waters of Lake Erie. His family, though they had no body to bury, held a funeral to say their goodbyes. Mary Lou was devastated, but she had to be strong for her children. She cashed in Larry's life insurance policy. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was enough to pay off their debts and give her and the kids a chance to start over, to build a new life without their father and husband. Fast forward 8 long years to 1965. Life had moved on for the Bader family. Larry's niece, a 21-year-old woman named Suzanne Pekka, was in Chicago for a sporting goods show. She was with a friend, and they were wandering through the massive convention hall, looking at all the latest fishing rods, camping gear, and hunting equipment. As they walked, they noticed a large crowd gathered around one of the exhibits off to the side. Curious, they decided to see what all the excitement was about. They worked their way through the group of people until they could see what was happening in the center. There, a man was putting on an archery demonstration. He had a big, thick mustache and was wearing a black eye patch over one eye. He stood with a confident posture, holding a bow, and was methodically shooting arrows at a target about 30 feet away. Suzanne and her friend watched for a few minutes, and it quickly became clear why this man had drawn such a crowd. He was an incredible archer. Arrow after arrow flew from his bow and landed squarely in the bullseye. He almost never missed. It was a mesmerizing display of skill. As they stood there watching, Suzanne's friend started looking more closely at the archer, not just at his skill, but at his face. After a moment, he turned to Suzanne with a strange look. He said to her, "Hey, doesn't that guy look exactly like your uncle? The one who disappeared on Lake Erie?" Suzanne was taken aback. Her Uncle Larry had been gone for 8 years, and it was strange to hear him mentioned so suddenly. But she turned her gaze back to the man with the eye patch, and this time she looked at him differently. And then she saw it. The resemblance was uncanny. Even with the mustache and the eye patch, the shape of his face, his build, the way he carried himself, it was a spitting image of her Uncle Larry. And then another piece clicked into place in her mind. Her Uncle Larry had also been known for being a phenomenal archer. It was one of his favorite hobbies. Here was a man who looked just like him and had the exact same rare talent. The coincidence felt too big to ignore. As soon as the demonstration ended and the crowd started to thin out, Suzanne and her friend rushed over to the man. Suzanne's heart was pounding. She walked right up to him and said, "I know this is going to sound crazy, but you look exactly like my uncle, Larry Bader. He went missing on Lake Erie 8 years ago." The man looked at her, and a polite, slightly confused smile crossed his face. He told her he was sorry, but he didn't know anyone named Larry Bader. He said his name was John Johnson, but everyone called him Fritz. He repeated that he was sorry, but he couldn't help her. But Suzanne wasn't convinced. The more she looked at him, the more certain she became. The denial didn't shake her. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, you are Larry Bader. I am positive you're my uncle." At this point, Fritz's politeness started to wear a little thin. He was firm, but not rude. He reiterated that he was not her uncle. He told her he didn't know who Larry Bader was, that he'd never been to Lake Erie. He tried to explain his life to her, to show her how impossible it was. He said he lived in Omaha, Nebraska with his wife and his kids. He told her he was a sports journalist on television in Omaha and also worked as a consultant for archery companies, which is why he was at the show. He looked at her completely bewildered and said he just didn't understand why she thought he was her uncle, but he wasn't. And with that, Fritz turned and walked away, leaving Suzanne and her friends standing there in shock. But they were not deterred. Not in the slightest. They were now more convinced than ever that this man was Larry Bader, and he was either lying or something very strange was going on. They ran to find a payphone. Suzanne called her 2 other uncles, Larry's brothers. She frantically explained what had just happened, how she had found a man who was the spitting image of their long-lost brother. Her uncles were skeptical at first, but the conviction in Suzanne's voice was enough. They told her to stay put. They booked the next flight to Chicago and flew out that very night. The next morning, Suzanne and her friend met her 2 uncles at the sporting goods show. They all went straight to the archery exhibit. And sure enough, there he was. Fritz Johnson, with his eye patch and mustache, doing another one of his incredible archery demonstrations. They waited patiently until there was a break. Then the 4 of them, Suzanne, her friend, and Larry Bader's 2 brothers, walked over to him. As soon as the brothers saw Fritz up close, any doubt they might have had vanished. Despite the eye patch, despite the mustache, despite the 8 years that had passed, they knew this was their brother. They approached him calmly. One of the brothers spoke, telling him that they knew he was saying he wasn't Larry, but the resemblance was just too strong to be a coincidence. He explained that they had been searching for their brother for a very long time. Then he pulled out some papers. He told Fritz that they had Larry's old military records, which included a full set of his fingerprints. He asked Fritz, "Please, just humor us. Come with us to the police station and get your fingerprints taken. It's the only way to prove to us that you aren't our brother." It would be a huge favor and would finally give them some closure. Fritz was clearly annoyed. He didn't want to do it. This whole thing was a ridiculous distraction. But he looked at the hopeful, desperate faces of these strangers and sighed. He figured it was the quickest way to end this bizarre situation. He said, "Fine. I'll go to the police station. I'll get my fingerprints taken, and then we can all put this behind us." And so, later that day, they all left the sporting goods show and went to a local Chicago police station. Fritz Johnson sat patiently while an officer rolled his fingertips in ink and pressed them onto a card. The officer then took the new prints and compared them with the ones from Larry Bader's military file. After a few minutes of careful examination, the officer looked up at Fritz, and he told him, "You are Larry Bader." When Fritz heard those words, he was in a state of pure disbelief. It wasn't a moment of revelation for him. No flood of lost memories came rushing back. In fact, it was the exact opposite. His mind was a blank slate when it came to Larry Bader. He immediately started trying to make sense of it, racking his brain, searching for any inconsistency in his own memory, any clue that his life as Fritz Johnson wasn't real, but he found nothing. All he could remember was a continuous, unbroken life. He had memories of being a young child named Fritz Johnson, growing up and living his life all the way up to that present moment in the police station. But now he was being told that the vast majority of those memories were a complete fabrication. He was never a child named Fritz Johnson. He was Larry Bader, a man from Ohio, and he had only become Fritz Johnson 8 years ago. The timeline of what actually happened is still murky, but investigators were able to piece together a rough sketch. It seems that just a few days, or maybe a few months, after Larry Bader disappeared on Lake Erie, a man calling himself Fritz Johnson showed up in Omaha, Nebraska. He walked into a local restaurant and asked for a job. He provided documents that seemed to prove his identity, and nobody had any reason to question him. He seemed like a completely normal, friendly guy. There was nothing about his behavior that raised any red flags. Over the next 8 years, Fritz wove himself into the very fabric of the Omaha community. He got married to a woman there. He had a child with her and adopted another. He was a good husband and a good father. He eventually left his job as a bartender and, through his charisma and talent, landed an amazing job as a sports broadcaster for the local television station. In Omaha, Fritz Johnson was a minor celebrity. People recognized him on the street. They'd wave and say, "Hey, Fritz, how are you doing?" He had built a full, successful, and happy life from scratch. But as soon as the news broke that he was actually Larry Bader, that carefully constructed life came crashing down around him. The television station he worked for fired him immediately. His second wife, the woman in Omaha, left him. It turned out their marriage had never been legally valid in the first place because Larry Bader was still legally married to his first wife, Mary Lou. And to make matters worse, the insurance company that had paid out the life insurance policy to Mary Lou all those years ago now demanded that the money be repaid in full. Throughout this entire chaotic ordeal, as his world fell apart, Fritz continued to insist that he was not Larry Bader. He was convinced it was all a huge, unexplainable mistake. He simply could not comprehend how any of this could have happened. It made no sense to him. Eventually, a team of experts, including doctors and psychologists, was brought in to examine him. They put him through nearly 2 weeks of intensive tests and evaluations. At the end of it all, they came to two firm conclusions. First, there was no doubt whatsoever that he was, in fact, Larry Bader. The physical evidence was undeniable. And second, he was almost certainly suffering from an extreme and profound case of amnesia, a total loss of his previous identity and memories. But how he had developed this amnesia, the doctors had no idea. And of course, Fritz had no idea either. It's unlikely we will ever get any more answers about what truly happened to Larry Bader on that stormy day on Lake Erie. Because just 1 year after his old identity was discovered, Fritz Johnson, or Larry Bader, passed away. He had been suffering from cancer in one of his eyes, which was why he wore the eye patch. The cancer returned, and this time it took his life. He died without ever recovering a single memory of his life as Larry Bader. Today, his case is still considered one of the most baffling and believable cases of profound amnesia ever recorded. He was a man who lived two completely separate lives, and he died only remembering one of them. Just outside of the popular tourist town of Amaga in northern Colombia, there's a thick green jungle that stretches for miles. If you know where to look, you can find a narrow walking path that winds its way from the edge of the town deep into the wilderness. If you follow that path far enough, it will eventually lead you to a truly incredible sight, an enormous old railroad bridge that spans a huge deep ravine. The bridge is no longer used for trains. It was decommissioned many years ago. But ironically, since the trains stopped running, the bridge has seen more traffic than ever. It's just a different kind of traffic now. People come from all over to visit this bridge for one specific, heart-pounding reason: to go bungee jumping. Bungee jumping is a thrill-seeking activity where people leap from high places, like this very bridge, with a long, elastic rope tied to their ankles. The length of that rope is carefully calculated so that when it stretches to its absolute limit, the jumper will stop just short of hitting the ground below. It's an adrenaline rush unlike any other. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez was living in the city of Medellin, about an hour north of Amaga. She turned to her boyfriend and told him she was finally ready to do it. She wanted to go bungee jumping. This was a conversation they had had many times before. Yesenia had always been fascinated by the idea of it, but every time they made actual plans to go, her fear would get the better of her and she would back out at the last minute. But this time was different. For whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia felt she had the courage to finally see it through. Her boyfriend, hearing the seriousness in her voice, seized the opportunity. He had never been bungee jumping either and was eager to try it, but he wouldn't go without her. Now that she seemed genuinely committed, he immediately got on the phone and called the Amaga Bungee Jumping Company. He booked a spot for both of them to jump from the famous railroad bridge. On the day of their jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend got in their car and made the hour-long drive south to Amaga. They found the walking trail and began the trek through the jungle out to the bridge. When they finally emerged from the trees and stepped onto the structure, they were stunned. They knew it was a popular spot, but they had not expected to see so many people. A long line of jumpers, nearly 100 of them, was already snaking its way across the bridge, all waiting for their turn to take the leap. Yesenia and her boyfriend found the end of the line and began their wait. Over the next several hours, they had a front row seat to the spectacle. One by one, they watched the people ahead of them get harnessed up, walk to the edge, and plummet into the ravine below, their screams of terror quickly turning into shouts of joy. In her mind, Yesenia had pictured arriving at the bridge, quickly getting it over with, and then celebrating their bravery. But this long, drawn-out wait was having the opposite effect. With every person who jumped, her own anxiety grew. Suddenly, bungee jumping didn't look fun at all. It looked terrifying. She started to second-guess her decision all over again. Her boyfriend could see the panic rising in her eyes. He tried to calm her down, pointing out how safe it was. He told her to look at all the people who had already jumped. They were all perfectly fine, all smiling and laughing. He told her how proud she would be of herself once it was over. But despite his best efforts, Yesenia couldn't shake the fear. Still, she told him she wasn't going to back down. She was determined to go through with it. Several more high-stress hours passed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line. A staff member who had been running the jumps all day long signaled for them to step forward onto the launch platform. They walked to the very edge, looking down into the vast empty space of the ravine. The staff began fitting them with their harnesses and safety gear. The whole time, Yesenia's panic was escalating. Her heart was hammering in her chest. Her vision started to narrow. This didn't feel like an adventure anymore. It just felt like something she had to survive. She just wanted it to be over. As the staff members were making their final checks, one of them looked at her boyfriend, whose gear was fully connected, and gave the signal. He said, "Okay, jump." Yesenia heard the command. In her panicked state, in the blur of fear and adrenaline, she thought he was talking to her. And so, without a moment's hesitation, Yesenia jumped. But she had made a terrible mistake. The staff member had been talking to her boyfriend, not to her. The staff had only finished putting her harness on. They had not yet attached the actual elastic bungee rope to her ankles. When Yesenia leaped from the platform, there was nothing to stop her fall. Her boyfriend watched in horror. He ripped off his own gear and sprinted down the bridge, leaping over the railing and scrambling down the steep, rocky hillside into the ravine. But by the time he reached his girlfriend at the bottom, it was too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined that Yesenia did not die from the impact with the ground. The autopsy revealed that she had actually died from a massive heart attack that she suffered during the fall. This means she must have realized in those few terrifying seconds after she jumped that she had made a mistake. She knew the bungee cord wasn't attached. And the sheer overwhelming fear of what was about to happen is what literally killed her before she ever reached the bottom. In early 1974, in the small town of Ossett in central England, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was living a happy life. He had a wife named Christine and 5 children, and he was known throughout their neighborhood as a great father and a wonderful husband with a fantastic sense of humor. Neighbors would often say that when you walked past the Taylor house, you could almost always hear the sound of Michael laughing or telling jokes to his family. Their home was a place filled with joy. But in April of that year, everything changed. Michael was doing some repairs around the house when he fell from a ladder and injured his back. The injury itself wasn't severe, but it left him with chronic, nagging pain. And that constant pain began to change him. The cheerful, funny, happy-go-lucky Michael Taylor slowly disappeared. In his place was a man who was sad, withdrawn, and deeply depressed. He became so irritable that his own family found it difficult to be around him. He would lash out at them over the smallest things. The laughter in the Taylor home was replaced with a tense silence. The Taylors were not a particularly religious family, but in a small town like Ossett at that time, most of their friends and neighbors were. When one of Michael's friends learned about how much he was struggling, he approached Michael with a suggestion. He told him that he should really consider turning to religion for help and guidance. Specifically, he recommended a local Christian group called the Christian Fellowship Group. It wasn't a formal church, but rather a small, dedicated prayer group for people who wanted a deeper level of spiritual support. But the real draw of this group, the friend explained, was its leader. Her name was Marie Robinson. She was only 21 years old, but she was incredibly charismatic, energetic, and friendly. She had a special way of making everyone in her group feel welcome and important. Michael's friend was convinced that Marie could be the one to help him, that she could help him find his way back to being his old self. Michael was at rock bottom. He was desperate and felt like he had nothing to lose. So he agreed to give it a try. On the 12th of September, 1974, Michael went to the church where the fellowship group held its meetings. He walked inside and found his way to a back room. When he entered, he saw about 20 people sitting in a circle of chairs. As soon as they noticed him, they all stood up and greeted him with open arms, welcoming him and inviting him to sit with them. Then, the woman who had to be Marie stood up. She had a huge, warm smile on her face. She looked directly at Michael and encouraged him to come and take the empty seat right next to her. For the first time in a very long time, a genuine smile spread across Michael's face. He walked across the room and sat down beside Marie. As she began to lead the group in prayer, Michael noticed something incredible. For that brief period of time, he didn't feel his chronic back pain. He just felt happy again. But when the meeting was over and Michael returned home, the pain and the depression came flooding back. It was as if the only place he could find relief was inside that church with that group. And so, Michael became completely devoted to it. He attended every single meeting. Over the next couple of weeks, he grew very close to Marie, and it seemed that Marie was growing very close to him as well. They started staying behind after the meetings were over, just the two of them, spending time together in what they called quiet prayer. Nobody knew exactly what they were doing, but their bond was obvious. It wasn't long before other members of the group began to suspect that they were having an affair. In a small town like Osset, rumors travel fast. The whispers from inside the church soon spread throughout the town. And before long, Michael's wife, Christine, started hearing them from her friends and neighbors. She was told that her husband was cheating on her with the young leader of his new prayer group. Christine had already had her own suspicion. Marie was the only thing Michael ever talked about anymore. On October 1st, just a few weeks after Michael first joined the group, Christine decided she had to know the truth. She waited until Michael left the house to head to his evening meeting. Then she got in her car and followed him to the church. She parked across the street, took a deep breath to steady her nerves, and then she got out and marched towards the front doors. She stormed inside, found the room where the meeting was being held, and burst through the door. She pointed directly at her husband, who was sitting with his back to her, and she yelled, "I know you're having an affair with Marie." You're going to admit it, right here, in front of this whole group. Michael stood up from his chair. But instead of turning to face his wife, instead of addressing her accusation, he turned and stared across the room at Marie. And when Marie made eye contact with him, she let out a blood-curdling scream. She would later say that in that moment, Michael didn't look human. He looked, in her words, like a beast. His eyes were wild. As Michael stood there, locked in this intense, aggressive stare with Marie, he suddenly began speaking in tongues. It's a phenomenon where a person utters words or sounds that resemble a language, but it's unintelligible to the speaker. The belief is that some other entity is speaking through them. Michael was barking these strange words and sounds at Marie. Everyone else in the room was frozen in shock. It had all happened so fast. Christine's sudden accusation, Michael's bizarre and terrifying reaction. Before anyone could do anything, Michael went from just speaking in tongues to lunging across the room as if he was going to physically attack Marie. Instantly, the other members of the group sprang into action. They jumped on top of Michael, trying to hold him down. But even with 10 or 15 people piling on top of him, he fought with an incredible strength, screaming and snarling, still trying to get to Marie. And then, something even stranger happened. Marie herself suddenly broke out into tongues. And as soon as she did, Michael stopped struggling so violently. He stayed on the floor, pinned down, and just continued to speak in tongues back at her. The two of them were looking at each other, having this strange, otherworldly conversation, while the rest of the group, completely dumbfounded, could only pray. After about an hour of this, Michael suddenly went limp. He collapsed as if he had lost consciousness. The room fell silent. Everyone stared at Michael's still form on the floor. After a moment, his eyes fluttered open. He looked around frantically as if he was waking up in a strange place with no idea how he had gotten there. Michael would claim he had absolutely no memory of the events that had just transpired. At this point, Marie turned to him and Christine. She told them that she believed Michael was possessed by a demonic force. And the only way to help him, she said, was to perform an exorcism. An exorcism is a religious ritual aimed at expelling a supposedly evil spirit from a person or a place. Michael and Christine were completely at a loss. They were both in a state of shock for very different reasons, and they had no idea what to do. They simply deferred to Marie's judgment. They agreed that an exorcism seemed like the only way forward. So they left the church and went home. The next morning, Marie contacted the Anglican Church of England and formally requested an exorcism for Michael Taylor. After hearing the details of what had happened, the church agreed. They said it did indeed sound like a case that required an exorcism. The following day, they sent two of their most experienced exorcists, a man named Peter and another named Raymond, to Ossett. Peter and Raymond went to the Taylor home and observed Michael. It didn't take them long to reach the same conclusion. They too believed that Michael was possessed by at least one demonic entity. They told Michael that an exorcism was the only solution, but they needed his full consent to proceed. Michael agreed. Christine, still completely overwhelmed and just going along with whatever the experts said, agreed as well. A day later, on the night of October 4th, everyone gathered at another church in a neighboring town. It was 10 p.m. Michael, Christine, the two exorcists, and all the members of the Christian fellowship group were there. Michael was seated in a chair in the middle of the room. As soon as Peter and Raymond began the ritual by praying, Michael erupted. He started screaming in tongues and writhing in his chair. He fell to the floor and began contorting his body into grotesque and unnatural positions, as if the words of the prayers were causing him physical agony. The exorcism went on for 8 straight hours. At one point, they had to physically tie Michael down to prevent him from harming himself or anyone else in the room. Finally, after 8 grueling hours, they stopped. Peter and Raymond were exhausted. Michael looked completely drained. As soon as the ritual paused, he collapsed on the ground unconscious. When he eventually came to, he was still tied down, and he looked around wildly, again with no memory of what had just happened. Peter and Raymond told him that the exorcism had been mostly successful. They claimed they had identified 40 different demons inside of him and that the ritual had managed to expel 37 of them. But, they warned, there were still 3 demons left inside. They were all too tired to continue right now. They told Michael to go home, get some rest, and they would return the next day to finish the job and cast out the final 3 demons. And so, Michael and Christine left the church and headed home. A few hours later, around noon the next day, a woman who lived near the Taylors heard a strange noise outside her house. It sounded like someone yelling. She went to her front window and pulled back the curtain to look outside. What she saw made her gasp. Walking down the middle of the street was Michael Taylor. He was completely naked and covered from head to toe in blood. He was rambling incoherently about Satan. The woman immediately called the police. When the officers arrived, they found Michael curled up in the fetal position on the sidewalk outside the woman's house. He was giggling to himself like a small child. The police cautiously approached him. At some point, Michael seemed to snap out of his state and looked up at the officers as if he had no idea what was going on. They eventually got him to tell them his name and where he lived. After calling for backup to handle Michael, the first responding officers made their way to the Taylor residence. They went inside. and the moment they saw the scene, one of the officers turned around, ran back outside, and began to vomit on the lawn. The inside of the Taylor family home would become one of the most infamous and gruesome crime scenes in English history. A few hours earlier, when Michael and Christine had returned from the exorcism, Michael had fallen into another one of his trances. He had brutally attacked his wife, beating her until she fell to the ground. Then, as she was dying, Michael had jumped on top of her and, using only his bare hands, had ripped her face off and thrown it across the room. As she bled to death, he began rubbing her blood all over his own body. After she was dead, he found the family dog and killed it as well. Fortunately, their 5 children had not been home at the time of the horrific attack, and they were unharmed. During Michael's trial, both the prosecution and the defense pointed the finger at the Anglican Church and at Marie Robinson's religious group. They argued that by performing the exorcism, they had effectively convinced Michael that he was possessed by demons, which in turn caused him to have a psychotic break and act out with such extreme violence. Ultimately, Michael Taylor was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He spent only 4 years in psychiatric care before he was released. Today, he is reportedly still living as a free man in Ossett. But despite the legal outcome, there are many people, both religious and non-religious, who believe the case of Michael Taylor is one of the few genuine and terrifying cases of demonic possession in modern history. And as for whether Michael and Marie were actually having an affair, it was never definitively proven, but it has always been widely assumed that they were. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Our story begins in northeast Brazil in April of 1977. Apolinario Correa and his 3 brothers, Firmino, Oriano, and Jose, were hard workers. They made their living in a tough but honest way. They were lumberjacks, but not in the traditional sense of working in a vast forest. Their territory was a small, uninhabited island just off the coast called Ilha dos Caranguejos, or Crab Island. The brothers had a sturdy boat, and they'd make regular trips out to the island, chop down valuable timber, load it onto their boat, and sail back to the mainland to sell it to local construction companies. It was a good business. The wood from Crab Island was high quality, and because they were the only ones willing to go there, they had the whole place to themselves. And there was a very specific reason they were the only ones willing to go there. Most people in their coastal community were terrified of Crab Island. For generations, stories had been passed down. Spooky stories. People who had dared to venture onto the island, maybe for a picnic or to explore, would come back with unsettling tales. They'd talk about hearing strange voices whispering from deep within the island's dense forest, especially after the sun went down. This was particularly strange because everyone knew for a fact that nobody lived on the island. There were no homes, no shacks, nothing. And then there were the lights. Fishermen out on the water at night would sometimes see bizarre, colorful lights flashing and dancing above the treetops of Crab Island, with no logical explanation. It was a place steeped in local folklore, a place most people gave a wide berth. But the Correa brothers were practical men. Apolinario, the oldest, was level-headed. Firmino was strong and quiet. Oriano was the joker of the group, and Jose, the youngest, looked up to them all. They had heard the stories their whole lives, but they just didn't buy into them. To them, the whispers were just the wind in the trees, and the lights were probably just swamp gas or some other natural phenomenon. The fear their neighbors had was actually a business advantage. It meant no competition. So they went to Crab Island all the time, and it was always the same. Just them, the trees, and the sound of the ocean. It was just another job site. On the morning of the 25th of April, 1977, the 4 brothers readied their boat for another trip. The plan was simple, the same one they'd executed dozens of times. They would set off in the morning and aim to arrive at the island around noon, which was high tide. This was important because the waters around Crab Island were very shallow, surrounded by vast mudflats. You could only get the boat close to the shore during high tide. They'd anchor the boat, wade to the island, and spend the entire afternoon felling trees. As the tide went out, their boat would eventually come to rest on the soft mud, stranded until the tide came back in. This was all part of the plan. They didn't intend to sail back right away. They'd finish their work, cook dinner over a campfire on the beach, and then head back to the boat to get a few hours of sleep. By the time they woke up around midnight, the next high tide would have lifted their boat free from the mud, and they could begin the peaceful journey home under the stars. It was a solid, well-rehearsed plan. And so, that's exactly what they did. They arrived at Crab Island at about 12 p.m., the sun high in the sky. The day was hot and humid, and the work was grueling. For hours, the only sounds on the island were the rhythmic thud of their axes against wood and the crash of falling trees. They worked until their muscles ached and their shirts were soaked with sweat. As evening approached, the sky turned a brilliant orange and purple. They gathered up their tools and built a small, crackling campfire on the beach. They cooked their simple dinner of fish and rice, talking and laughing as they always did. They probably made fun of the ghost stories, feeling perfectly safe and content on their island. Around 8 p.m., after they'd finished eating, Apollinario took a bucket of seawater and carefully doused the campfire, making sure every last ember was extinguished. The only light now came from the moon, casting long shadows across the beach. The tide was fully out. Their boat was sitting about 100 yards away, a dark silhouette resting on the glistening mudflats. The four brothers took off their boots, rolled up their pants, and began the familiar trudge through the thick, ankle-deep mud towards their vessel. They climbed aboard, rinsed the mud from their feet, and went into the small main cabin. It was cramped, but it was shelter. They laid out their sleeping pads on the floor, and exhausted from the day's labor, it didn't take long for all four of them to fall into a deep, dreamless sleep. Apollinario had only meant to sleep for a few hours, just until the tide came back in. But when he opened his eyes again, he knew instantly that something was wrong. The air inside the cabin was still and dark, but through the small porthole window, he could see that the sky outside wasn't black anymore. It was that soft, hazy pink of early dawn. He let out a frustrated groan. They had all slept right through the midnight high tide. Their boat had been lifted by the water, and then, as the tide receded again, it had settled right back down into the mud. They were stuck. Again. Now they'd have to wait all the way until the next high tide, likely around noon. A whole half-day wasted. Annoyed, Apollinario sat up and looked around the small cabin to see if his brothers were awake. He saw the familiar lumps of his two brothers, Firmino and Jose, still asleep on their pads. They each had their thin blankets pulled up right over their faces to block out the morning light. But then his eyes fell on the third sleeping pad, the one belonging to his brother, Oriano. It was empty. The blanket was tossed aside. Oriano wasn't in the cabin. Apollinario wasn't immediately alarmed. Oriano was an early riser. He was probably just outside on the deck, getting some fresh air, or answering the call of nature. But just as Apollinario was thinking this, the sound hit him. A piercing, blood-curdling scream from just outside the cabin door. It was a sound of absolute, unimaginable pain. It was Oriano's voice. In a split second, Apollinario's annoyance at oversleeping was replaced by a jolt of pure adrenaline and fear. He scrambled to his feet, threw open the cabin door, and rushed out onto the deck. And what he saw made him freeze in his tracks. There was his brother, Oriano, standing there, clutching at his own body, his face twisted in a mask of agony. His skin, all of his exposed skin on his face, his neck, his arms, was a mess of horrific burns. It looked like someone had taken a blowtorch to him. It was red and blistering, and in some places, it looked like it was literally peeling away from the muscle. Apollinario was so horrified he couldn't move. His brain just couldn't process what he was seeing. And then, through the shock, he noticed something that was even stranger, something that made absolutely no sense. Despite the terrible burns that covered his brother's body, Oriano's clothes, his simple work shirt and pants, were perfectly fine. They weren't scorched, they weren't singed, there wasn't a single mark on them. It was as if his skin had spontaneously caught on fire from the inside out, while leaving his clothes completely untouched. Oriano was just screaming and screaming, stumbling around the deck in pure agony, and Apollinario had no idea what to do, no idea what could have possibly caused this. While Apollinario stood there, frozen in shock, he heard another sound. This one was coming from back inside the cabin where he had just been. It was a low, guttural moaning, a sound of deep suffering. Acting on pure instinct, he spun around and ran back into the cabin. He knew the sound was coming from one of his other two brothers, who were still under their blankets. He lurched towards the closest one, Firmino, and tore the blanket off of him. The sight was just as horrifying as what he'd seen on deck. Firmino was writhing on his sleeping pad, moaning in pain, and his skin was just as horribly burned as Oriano's. It was raw and red and looked like it was sliding off his body. And just like with Oriano, Firmino's clothes were completely undamaged. Apollinario's mind was reeling. What was happening? Was this a nightmare? His eyes darted over to his last brother Jose, who was still lying on his sleeping pad, the blanket still covering him. He was quiet. He wasn't moaning. Maybe he was okay. With a trembling hand, Apollinario reached over and pulled back Jose's blanket. Jose was not burned. There wasn't a mark on him. But he was not okay. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling of the cabin. He wasn't breathing. Jose was dead. The next 6 hours must have been the longest and most torturous of Apollinario's life. He was on a tiny boat, stuck in the mud, on a supposedly haunted island. His brother Oriano was outside, still screaming in agony from his mysterious burns. His brother Firmino was inside, barely conscious and fading fast from his own horrific injuries. And his youngest brother Jose was lying dead just a few feet away. There was nothing he could do. He couldn't call for help, they had no radio, and he couldn't leave. He had to simply wait, surrounded by death and suffering, for the tide to slowly, agonizingly creep back in and lift their boat from the mud. He tried to comfort his injured brothers, to give them water, to do anything, but he was completely helpless. Finally, around noon, the water was high enough, the boat lifted, and Apollinario was free. He started the engine and raced back towards the mainland, his mind a chaotic storm of grief and confusion. When they finally reached their home port, a small crowd gathered, shocked at the scene. Oriano, who was badly hurt but still conscious and able to walk, stayed behind with the body of their brother Jose, waiting for the authorities. Apollinario knew Firmino's injuries were the most severe. He was slipping in and out of consciousness, and his body looked like it was shutting down. Apollinario had to get him to a hospital, and fast. He managed to get his brother into a vehicle and sped off towards the nearest medical facility. When they arrived at the hospital, doctors and nurses rushed out to help. Firmino was barely clinging to life. As they got him onto a gurney and started wheeling him into the emergency room, a doctor leaned in close to him. The doctor knew they needed to understand what had happened to treat these bizarre injuries. He asked Firmino, "What happened? How did you get these burns?" Firmino's eyes fluttered open. He was barely able to speak, his voice a hoarse whisper. But right before he slipped into a deep coma from his burns, he was able to get out a few chilling words. He told the doctor that sometime during the night, while they were all asleep in the boat on Crab Island, he had woken up for a moment. He had looked out the small porthole window from inside the cabin. And what he saw, he said, was an inexplicable ball of fire just hovering in the air outside the boat. And that was the last thing he remembered. The local police were notified immediately, and they opened an investigation into the bizarre and tragic events on Crab Island. They were faced with a case that seemed to defy all logic. One man dead with no apparent cause, 2 men with catastrophic burns that seemed to appear out of nowhere, and 1 man, Apollinario, who was completely unharmed and completely bewildered. The first person they spoke to at length was Apollinario. He told them everything he could remember, from their normal workday to the horrifying discovery in the morning. He was clearly traumatized, and his story, as strange as it was, seemed genuine. The investigators had to consider all possibilities, no matter how unlikely. Their first theory was that some sort of fight had broken out among the brothers. Maybe an argument over money or work had escalated into extreme violence. Perhaps Apollinario was lying to cover up his own involvement. But this theory quickly fell apart. The Correa brothers were known to be very close. There was no history of violence or serious arguments between them. And, more importantly, this theory couldn't explain the physical evidence. How could a fight result in two men being burned so severely while their clothes remained untouched? And how did Jose die without a single mark on him? An autopsy would later be performed on Jose, and the coroner was stumped. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, likely brought on by extreme shock or terror. But what had terrified him to death? The police then considered the possibility of drugs or alcohol. Maybe the men had consumed some sort of hallucinogen, and in their altered state they had hurt themselves or each other. This could potentially explain their strange stories and lack of memory. But toxicology reports were run on all the brothers, including Jose. They all came back completely clean. There were no drugs, no unusual levels of alcohol, nothing in their systems that could explain what had happened. So, the investigators moved on to environmental factors. The most plausible, though still far-fetched, theory they could come up with was a freak lightning strike. Their idea was that maybe lightning had struck the wet beach or the water near the boat, and somehow the electrical charge had reflected off the sand or the water and shot into the boat, striking the men. But the experts they consulted said this was incredibly unlikely. A lightning strike powerful enough to inflict those kinds of burns would have left obvious signs of its passing. It would have scorched the boat, maybe blown a hole in the hull, or damaged the boat's electronics. But when the police forensics team went out to Crab Island to examine the boat and the surrounding area, they found nothing. The boat was completely undamaged. There were no scorch marks, no signs of an explosion or a fire. The beach was pristine. There were no unusual craters or fused sand that a lightning strike would leave behind. In fact, the big takeaway from the on-site investigation was that they found absolutely no evidence of anything unusual happening at all. It was as if the island itself was hiding its secrets. The only piece of information that pointed to something truly strange was Firmino's dying declaration about the ball of fire. The police had to consider it, but what could they do with it? To them, it sounded like the hallucination of a man in extreme pain and shock. A ball of fire hovering in the air? It sounded like something from a science fiction story, not a police report. With no physical evidence, no witnesses who could remember anything, and no logical explanation, the investigation hit a dead end. Miraculously, both Firmino and Oriano survived. They spent months in the hospital undergoing painful treatments and skin grafts. They eventually made full physical recoveries. But the mental and emotional scars remained. And strangest of all, neither of them ever regained any memory of what happened that night. Their last clear memory was of going to sleep in the cabin. The next thing they knew, they were in unimaginable pain. The period in between was a complete and total blank. With their two key witnesses unable to provide any details, and with a total lack of evidence, the police had no choice but to close the case. The official file on the death of Jose Correa and the injuries of his brothers was stamped unsolved, with no official explanation ever given. The Correa family was left to grieve without answers, and the terrifying mystery of Crab Island only grew deeper. For 9 years, life went on. The surviving Correa brothers never returned to Crab Island. They found other ways to make a living. But the story of what happened to them became a legendary cautionary tale in their community. The island, which had always been considered haunted, was now seen as a place of genuine, tangible danger. People avoided it more than ever. The strange stories, however, didn't stop. Fishermen continued to report seeing odd lights in the sky over the island. But for 9 years, no one was brave or foolish enough to spend the night there. Then, in April of 1986, almost 9 years to the day after the Correa brothers' ordeal, a different crew of men decided to tempt fate. It was a team of 4 lumberjacks, unrelated to the Correas, who were new to the area. They heard that the timber on Crab Island was plentiful and untouched. They likely heard the stories as well, but just like the Correa brothers before them, they probably dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. They were there to do a job and make money, not to hunt for ghosts. Their plan was almost identical to the one the Correas had used. They sailed to the island, spent the day harvesting lumber, and as evening fell, they settled in for the night, planning to leave on the next high tide. They were out in the woods, not far from the beach, when suddenly all four of them recalled hearing a single, loud, crashing sound echo through the forest. It was a noise they couldn't identify. And right after they heard that sound, all four of them, at the exact same moment, simply fell unconscious. They didn't feel sick, they didn't feel dizzy. It was like a switch was flipped and their consciousness was just turned off. When they woke up again, it was 18 hours later. They were disoriented, confused, with massive gaps in their memory. As they slowly came to their senses and took stock of their situation, a horrifying sense of déjà vu fell over the island. One of the four men was dead. He had no visible injuries, no marks on his body. He was just gone. And another one of the men was inexplicably covered in severe burns. And just like with Firmino and Oriano 9 years earlier, the survivors' clothes were perfectly intact. The two other men were unharmed, but in a state of shock. When authorities investigated this second incident, they were faced with the exact same impossible puzzle. The survivors had no memory of what happened between hearing the crashing sound and waking up 18 hours later. The autopsy on the deceased man was, once again, inconclusive, pointing to a probable heart attack induced by terror. And the man with the burns couldn't explain how he got them. A thorough search of the island once again revealed nothing. No footprints, no scorch marks, no evidence of any kind. It was a near-perfect carbon copy of the tragedy that had befallen the Correa brothers. The two incidents, separated by 9 years, are so chillingly similar that it's hard to dismiss them as coincidence. In both cases, a group of lumberjacks spent the night on the island. In both cases, one person died of unexplained causes, appearing to be scared to death. In both cases, at least one other person suffered severe, unexplainable burns that did not affect their clothing. And in both cases, the survivors had complete amnesia of the event itself. So what is really happening on Crab Island? To this day, no one knows for sure. The official case files remain closed and unsolved. But there are theories, though they venture far from conventional explanations. Some people believe the island is home to a paranormal entity, a malevolent spirit that attacks those who trespass on its territory. The voices and the lights that people have reported for decades could be signs of this presence. Others look towards a more extraterrestrial explanation. The description Firmino gave of a ball of fire hovering in the air sounds very similar to many UFO sightings, specifically reports of ball lightning or unidentified aerial phenomena. The burns, which spared clothing, are consistent with injuries caused by intense microwave radiation, a technology often associated with advanced non-human craft. Perhaps these men stumbled upon something not of this world, something that reacted defensively and with lethal force. Whatever the truth is, the story of the Correa brothers and the second crew serves as a haunting reminder that there are still mysteries in this world that we cannot explain. For the families involved, there is no closure, only the lingering pain of loss and the endless, unanswerable question of what truly happened on those nights. Crab Island remains uninhabited, a place of quiet beauty by day and a place of profound, terrifying mystery by night. It stands as a silent monument to a series of events that defy logic and blur the line between folklore and a dark, terrifying reality. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Mount Fuji, standing majestically at 3,776 meters, is the highest peak in Japan. To millions around the world, its perfectly symmetrical snow-capped cone is a symbol of serenity, beauty, and spiritual peace. However, beneath this picturesque facade lies a volatile nature. Not only is Mount Fuji an active stratovolcano, but during the winter months, it transforms into an incredibly treacherous environment. Severe blizzards, sub-zero temperatures, gale-force winds, and sheets of solid, unyielding ice turn the scenic slopes into a deadly trap. For this reason, official climbing season is strictly limited to the summer months between July and September. During the winter, the mountain is officially closed to the public. Yet, there are no physical barriers or security guards stationed at the base of the mountain to stop determined individuals. Climbing during the off-season is a matter of personal responsibility and immense risk. While experienced mountaineers with specialized training, ice axes, heavy-duty crampons, and cold-weather gear can successfully navigate the winter peak, anyone else attempting the climb is inviting disaster. In the late autumn of 2019, a 47-year-old Japanese man, known online as Tedu and to some viewers as Tedzu, decided to challenge the mountain. Tedu was an internet streamer and a thrill-seeker, but he was by no means a mountaineer. He lacked the physical conditioning, the survival training, and, most fatally, the correct equipment. His goal was not just to summit Mount Fuji in dangerous conditions, but to broadcast the entire journey live to his online audience on a popular streaming platform. He believed the extreme setting would attract a massive crowd of viewers seeking validation and fame from the digital world. On the morning of his climb, Tedu arrived at the Subashiri Trail. The weather at the base was chilly but seemingly manageable. However, his choice of gear immediately signaled trouble to anyone with basic hiking knowledge. Instead of specialized insulated layers, waterproof clothing, and mountaineering boots, Tedu wore basic street clothes. He carried lightweight trekking poles, which are useful for dirt paths but entirely useless on hard ice. Most importantly, he lacked crampons, the sharp metal spikes attached to boots that allow a climber to bite into ice, and an ice axe, the ultimate tool for stopping a sudden slide down a slope. His most vital piece of equipment, in his own eyes, was his smartphone attached to a selfie stick. As Tedu turned on his live stream and began his ascent, the broadcast started on a cheerful note. He chatted casually with his audience, commenting on the volcanic ash beneath his feet and the beautiful scenery. Early on, viewers tuned in out of curiosity, sending words of encouragement and digital gifts. The steady stream of real-time comments and notifications acted as a powerful psychological anchor, fueling his determination to keep moving forward. However, as Tedu pushed higher up the mountain, the environment began to change drastically. The dirt and volcanic ash gave way to patches of snow, which quickly turned into continuous sheets of hard, slippery ice. The ambient temperature plummeted well below freezing, and the wind began to howl, whipping up loose snow and drastically reducing visibility. Tedu's physical condition began to deteriorate rapidly. Because he was only wearing regular clothes, the extreme cold began to seep into his body. On screen, viewers watched as Tedu began to hyperventilate. He openly complained to his audience that his fingers were becoming completely numb and losing all sensation. He struggled to hold his smartphone steady, and his hands shook violently. At this point, the nature of the live chat began to shift. Several experienced hikers in the audience realized the gravity of the situation. They began typing urgent messages, pleading with him to turn back, warning him that frostbite was setting in and that the upper slopes were too dangerous. But Tedu was trapped in a psychological phenomenon known as the sunk cost fallacy, compounded by the pressure of a live audience. He felt he had already climbed too high and invested too much effort to simply give up. He also feared disappointing his viewers and losing the digital spotlight. Every time he looked at his phone, he saw the viewer count rising. Misinterpreting this morbid curiosity as support, he pressed on, dismissing the warnings. As he neared the steep final stretch just below the summit, the trail became incredibly narrow and steep. The safety ropes and fences installed for summer tourists were completely buried under feet of ice or dismantled. The terrain was now a literal sheet of glass, tilted at a brutal angle. Tedu was forced to rely entirely on his lightweight trekking poles, which bounced uselessly off the hard ice instead of digging in. His regular shoes had absolutely no traction. The live stream captured his final, agonizing minutes. Tedu was slipping constantly, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He noted aloud how incredibly steep the slope had become and how dangerous the footing looked. Yet, he took another step forward. Suddenly, the camera angle jerked violently. The smooth motion of his walk broke. Tedu had lost his footing on a patch of black ice. "Wait! I'm slipping!" Tedu cried out, his voice instantly shifting from exhaustion to pure panic. Because he lacked an ice axe, he had no way to perform a self-arrest, a technique where a climber throws their body weight onto an axe to dig into the mountain and stop a fall. Without it, the steep, icy slope acted like a massive, frictionless slide. Tedu began to slide down the mountainside, gaining speed with every passing second. The smartphone, still broadcasting live, spun wildly, showing chaotic, terrifying blurs of white snow, blue sky, and the steep drop below. Tedu's voice could be heard over the rushing wind, uttering his final chilling words. Well, it can't be helped. It was a phrase of grim resignation, a realization that he had made a fatal mistake and there was absolutely nothing he could do to fix it. The thousands of viewers watching the stream could only look on in absolute horror as the camera suddenly froze, showing a still image of a trekking pole resting on the snow before the connection cut to absolute silence. The next day, search and rescue teams deployed a helicopter to scour the treacherous winter slopes of Mount Fuji. Given the extreme speed of his slide, Tedu had traveled an immense distance down the mountain in a matter of seconds. Rescue workers eventually located his lifeless body at an altitude of approximately 2,700 meters more than 1,000 meters below the point where he had slipped. The brutal fall down the rocky, icy mountainside had killed him instantly. He had traded his life for a temporary surge in internet viewership, leaving behind a haunting digital record of his own final moments. In the turbulent landscape of late 20th century Mexico, few figures loomed as large or as tragically as Rosalino Chelino Sanchez. Born in 1962 into grinding poverty in the rural, cartel-dominated state of Sinaloa, Chelino's life was practically destined to be shaped by violence. Sinaloa was a place where local disputes were settled with gunfire and where the line between folk heroes and outlaws was often blurred. For Chelino, this brutal reality struck early and intimately. When he was just a teenager, a local, wealthy, and powerful man assaulted his sister. In a society where justice from the authorities was a rare commodity, a 7-year-old Chelino took matters into his own hands. He tracked the man down to a local party and shot him dead, avenging his family's honor. Knowing that remaining in Sinaloa meant certain death or imprisonment, Chelino fled across the border into the United States. Settling in California, he survived by working various undocumented jobs, eventually teaming up with his brother, Armando, to operate a human smuggling ring. For a time, it seemed Chelino had escaped the cycle of violence, but Sinaloa's dark shadow caught up with him once more. In 1984, Armando was brutally murdered in a Tijuana hotel room. Devastated by the loss, Chelino sought a way to preserve his brother's memory and process his immense grief. He chose music. Chelino began writing corridos, traditional Mexican narrative ballads that historically told stories of the Mexican Revolution. However, Chelino modernized the genre, transforming it into narco-corridos, drug ballads. He did not sing about fictional heroes. Instead, he wrote raw, unvarnished, and deeply authentic songs about real-world cartel bosses, smugglers, gunfights, and betrayals. While spent time in a Tijuana prison for minor offenses, other inmates, many of whom were dangerous cartel soldiers, began hiring him to write ballads detailing their own exploits. Chelino possessed a rare gift. He could translate the gritty, violent realities of the criminal underworld into poetic, captivating lyrics. When he was released, his reputation exploded. Chelino's voice was untrained, raspy, and distinct, but what he lacked in classical vocal talent, he more than made up for in sheer authenticity. He sang with the conviction of a man who had lived through the very bloodshed he described. To the thousands of Mexican immigrants living in the United States and the youth back in Mexico, Chelino became an overnight cultural icon, pioneering a subgenre of music that would dominate the airwaves for decades. As his fame grew, so did the danger. In the world of narco-corridos, singing the praises of one cartel boss inevitably meant insulting a rival faction. Chelino knew he was constantly walking a tightrope, but he refused to back down. His legendary status was cemented in January 1992 during a performance at a club in Coachella, California. In the middle of his set, an armed man jumped onto the stage and pulled out a pistol, firing directly at the singer. Instead of running or ducking for cover, Cellino pulled a handgun from his own waistband and engaged in a fierce, close-quarters shootout with the assassin right in front of a terrified, screaming crowd. Though Cellino was hit in the torso and critical condition, he survived. The assassin was subdued, but the chaotic exchange left one bystander dead and several injured. This incident did not destroy Cellino's career, it turned him into a living myth. He was no longer just a musician singing about violence, he was a man who lived by the gun and was willing to die by it. He became the ultimate symbol of the unyielding, fearless outlaw. However, Cellino was a realist. He knew that surviving the Coachella shootout had only bought him a little time. He openly told friends and family that his days were numbered and that his enemies would eventually find a way to finish the job. 4 months later, in May 1992, Cellino made a fateful decision to return to his homeland of Sinaloa for a highly anticipated promotional tour. His triumphant homecoming culminated on the night of May 15th at the Salon Bugambilias in Culiacan. The venue was packed to the brim with passionate fans eager to see their idol return to the soil that birthed his music. The atmosphere was electric, but the undercurrent of danger was palpable. Just as Cellino was preparing to sing one of his most famous tracks, an unidentified man in the crowd stepped forward and handed a small piece of paper to someone on stage, who then passed it directly to the singer. The moment was captured perfectly on a fan's camcorder, preserving one of the most haunting images in music history. As Cellino unfolded the note and read it silently, his entire demeanor shattered. The tough, untouchable outlaw persona vanished in an instant. His face grew incredibly pale, his eyes widened with a mixture of profound shock and deep sorrow, and a heavy sweat broke out across his forehead. He wiped his brow, staring blankly out into the crowd, as the weight of the universe seemed to settle on his shoulders. The note was an explicit, undeniable death threat from the local cartels. It stated quite simply, "If you sing tonight, this will be your last performance. We are going to kill you as soon as you step off the stage." For a long, agonizing few seconds, Cellino stood frozen. He looked at the paper, then crumpled it up and stuffed it into his pocket. He had two choices. He could drop the microphone, flee the stage under guard and try to hide, or he could give his people what they came for. Choosing the path of a true artist, Cellino signaled the band to start playing. He looked out at the audience, smiled through his fear, and delivered what many witnesses later described as the most passionate, haunting, and flawless performance of his entire life. He sang every lyric as if it were a final confession, knowing with absolute certainty that every breath he took on that stage brought him closer to his demise. When the concert concluded, Cellino did not rush away. He intentionally lingered on the stage, waving to his fans and saying an extended, emotional goodbye to his band members, knowing he would never see them again. Hours later, in the early morning of May 16th, Cellino left the venue in a caravan with his brothers and cousins. As their vehicles navigated the dark streets of Culiacan, they were suddenly intercepted by a group of heavily armed men driving suburban vehicles. The men flashed badges claiming to be state police officers and demanded that Cellino step out of the vehicle. Recognizing the reality of the situation, Cellino complied to protect his family. He willingly got into their car and disappeared into the night. A few hours later, two farmers walking near an irrigation canal on the outskirts of Culiacan discovered a body dumped in the dirt. It was Cellino Sanchez. He was blindfolded, his wrists and ankles bore severe rope burns from being bound, and he had been shot twice in the back of the head, executed in classic cartel fashion at just 29 years old. Cellino's final moments on stage, captured forever on film, remain an indelible testament to a man who looked his own mortality directly in the eyes and chose to sing his heart out anyway. The 25th of September, 1978, began as a picture-perfect morning in Southern California. The sky over San Diego was a flawless, brilliant blue, completely devoid of clouds. Visibility was virtually unlimited, extending for miles in every direction. For aviation professionals, it was the kind of pristine weather that promised an effortless day of flying. Among the thousands of people traveling through the air that morning were the passengers and crew of Pacific Southwest Airlines PSA Flight 182. PSA was a beloved regional airline affectionately known for its bright, cheerful brand. The company famously painted a black smile beneath the nose cone of every aircraft, earning them the nickname the Grinning Birds. The flight crew on duty was highly experienced. At the controls was Captain James McFerrin, a veteran pilot with over 14,000 hours of flight time, accompanied by First Officer Robert Fox and Flight Engineer Martin Wan. Flight 182 was a Boeing 727-200 commercial airliner en route from Sacramento to San Diego's Lindbergh Field, carrying 128 passengers and 7 crew members. Many on board were PSA employees commuting to work or heading home, creating a relaxed, friendly atmosphere in the cabin. At the same time, a completely different type of aviation operation was taking place in the very same airspace. A small, single-engine Cessna 172 was flying on a training mission. Inside the tiny cockpit were 2 men, David Boswell, a 35-year-old Marine Corps sergeant practicing instrument landing approaches, and his instructor, Martin Kazi, a seasoned 32-year-old pilot. They were practicing a series of specific maneuvers under the guidance of San Diego's Air Traffic Control, ATC. Because the weather was so exceptionally clear, the air traffic controllers instructed the crew of PSA Flight 182 to transition from instrument flight rules to visual flight rules, VFR. Under VFR, the ultimate responsibility for maintaining a safe distance from other aircraft shifts from the controllers on the ground to the eyes of the pilots in the cockpit. It is a fundamental rule of the skies: see and avoid. As the massive Boeing 727 began its descent into the San Diego area, the approach controller radioed Captain McFerrin, alerting him to the presence of the small Cessna ahead of them. The controller stated that the Cessna was maintaining an altitude of about 3,500 feet and heading in a similar direction. Captain McFerrin acknowledged the warning, and First Officer Fox quickly spotted a small plane outside his window. "Got him," Fox said, reporting to the captain that they had the traffic in sight. However, a fatal misunderstanding was quietly unfolding inside the Boeing's cockpit. The air traffic controller had warned them about Boswell and Kazi's Cessna 172. But because San Diego's skies were always busy, the PSA pilots had actually spotted a completely different third aircraft that happened to be flying in the vicinity. Unaware that they were looking at the wrong plane, the crew assumed the primary threat had already passed safely behind them. A few moments later, Flight 182 was handed over to the Lindbergh Field Airport Tower Controller. The tower controller, assuming the PSA crew was still actively watching the Cessna they had originally discussed, told them to maintain visual separation. Inside the cockpit, confusion began to brew. The pilots began to question where the Cessna actually was. "I think he's passed off to our right," Captain McFerrin muttered, looking out into the blue sky. "Yeah," First Officer Fox responded, though his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. The cockpit voice recorder would later reveal that the crew wasn't entirely sure. They began discussing the target in fragmented sentences. At one point, a voice in the cockpit murmured, "I hope so." Unfortunately, instead of asking air traffic control for an explicit clarification or requesting radar assistance to pinpoint the rogue aircraft, the crew allowed the conversation to drift. They assumed everything was fine. Meanwhile, the Cessna was flying directly ahead of the giant airliner. Because it was much smaller and slower, the Boeing 727 was rapidly gaining on it from behind. Crucially, due to the high-nosed pitch of the Boeing 727 as it prepared for landing, the Cessna fell directly into a catastrophic blind spot. It was positioned directly beneath the nose and cockpit floor of the airliner. The PSA pilots could look forward and sideways all they wanted, but it was physically impossible for them to see the small plane directly beneath their feet. Down on the ground, the automated conflict alert system at the Air Traffic Control Center began to flash and sound an alarm, indicating that the radar paths of the two planes were about to merge. The controller noticed the warning but chose not to issue an urgent, evasive command to the PSA jet. Because the PSA pilots had explicitly stated earlier that they had the traffic, the controller assumed the commercial pilots were fully aware of the Cessna and were intentionally passing close by it. The controller merely radioed the Cessna crew to inform them of the fast-approaching jet. At exactly 9:47 a.m., the unthinkable happened. The massive belly and right wing of the Boeing 727 slammed into the tiny Cessna from behind at an altitude of approximately 2,600 feet. The impact was violent and instantaneous. The Cessna disintegrated into a ball of fire, its fuselage breaking into pieces and tearing into the right wing of the airliner. The collision completely shattered the internal hydraulic lines inside the Boeing's right wing, rendering the flaps and control surfaces entirely useless. The right wing erupted into flames. Inside the cockpit of Flight 182, a blaring chorus of master caution, alarms, and fire warnings filled the air. The plane instantly rolled violently to the right, its nose dipping down into an unrecoverable steep dive toward the earth. Despite the terrifying forces pulling at the aircraft, Captain McFerrin and his crew displayed incredible professionalism, fighting the controls until the very end. Realizing that the hydraulic fluid was completely gone and the plane was unresponsive, McFerrin keyed his microphone to radio his final transmission to the tower. "Tower, we're going down. This is PSA," he said, his voice remarkably steady despite the circumstances. "Okay," the tower controller replied, unaware of the scale of the disaster. "We'll call the equipment for you." Inside the cabin, passengers were thrown against their seats as the ground rushed up at a terrifying speed of over 300 miles per hour. In those final, agonizing seconds, the cockpit voice recorder captured a deeply human moment. Amidst the mechanical wailing of the dying aircraft, the crew said their final goodbyes. "Easy, baby," a voice muttered, trying to soothe the dying machine. Then, just before impact, a final voice whispered over the intercom, "I love you, Mom." At 9:07 a.m., just 20 seconds after the collision, PSA Flight 182 slammed directly into the residential neighborhood of North Park, San Diego, exploding in a massive fireball that sent a column of black smoke thousands of feet into the air. The impact demolished an entire city block, destroying 22 homes. All 135 people on board the Boeing, both pilots in the Cessna, and 7 people on the ground were killed instantly, bringing the total death toll to 144. It was, at the time, the deadliest aviation disaster in United States history, a heartbreaking catastrophe born from a single, quiet moment of visual confusion in a perfectly clear sky. Human beings are hardwired to fear heights. It is an evolutionary survival mechanism designed to keep us away from steep drops and unstable edges. For 5-year-old Yenya Gomez, this fear was not just a passing discomfort, it was a deeply rooted, lifelong phobia. Yenya was a successful, intelligent young lawyer living in Colombia. She was known to her friends and family as someone who was generally cautious, analytical, and reserved. However, like many people who struggle with intense anxieties, Yenya harbored a quiet desire to conquer her fears. She wanted to prove to herself that she was stronger than the phobias that sought to control her. In July of 2021, an opportunity arose to face her ultimate fear. Her boyfriend, an adventure enthusiast, suggested they go bungee jumping. The location was a notorious hotspot for thrill seekers in the mountainous region of Amagá, located near the vibrant city of Medellin. The jumping platform was built onto an old, abandoned railway bridge that spanned a massive, breathtaking gorge. Suspended hundreds of feet above a dense green jungle canopy and a rocky riverbed, the bridge was both beautiful and utterly terrifying. To Yenya, looking down into that vast chasm was the definition of a nightmare. Yet, with her boyfriend by her side offering constant encouragement, she made the brave decision to sign up. She wanted to step off that ledge and feel the weight of her fear vanish. However, the reality of the experience began to fall apart the moment they arrived at the site. Because it was a popular weekend, the bridge was completely overwhelmed with tourists. The local adventure company running the operation was struggling to keep up with the massive crowd, resulting in chaotic organization and extremely long delays. Yenya and her boyfriend were forced to stand in a tightly packed queue on the narrow bridge for several agonizing hours. For someone already battling a severe phobia, this extended waiting period was a psychological disaster. Instead of getting the jump over with quickly to experience a rush of relief, Yenya was trapped with her thoughts. For hours, she had to stand on the edge, listening to the rushing wind, looking down into the abyss, and watching person after person scream as they plummeted off the platform. This prolonged exposure did not desensitize her. Instead, it triggered a massive, compounding panic attack. Her heart rate began to skyrocket, her breathing became shallow and rapid, and a heavy sense of dread clouded her mind. Her brain entered a state of pure fight or flight, a condition where logical reasoning shuts down and the body focuses entirely on surviving the perceived threat. She was no longer jumping for fun. She was in a desperate, frantic hurry to get the ordeal over with so she could escape the suffocating anxiety. Finally, after hours of mental torture, their names were called. The couple stepped onto the wooden jumping platform. Due to the high volume of customers and the noise of the wind, the instructors were rushing through their safety checks, trying to move people through the line as quickly as possible. Yenya was in a state of near-blind panic, suffering from a psychological phenomenon known as tunnel vision or auditory exclusion. When a human being is engulfed by extreme terror, their brain filters out peripheral sights and sounds, focusing only on the immediate center of attention. For Yenya, the entire world had shrunk down to the edge of the wooden platform and the voice of the jump instructor. The instructors began preparing the couple. They slipped a heavy, secure body harness around Yenya's torso. This harness was designed to distribute the force of the fall across her chest and waist. However, in bungee jumping, the actual heavy-duty elastic cord is not always attached directly to the torso harness first. It is often clamped securely onto separate ankle straps or a primary carabiner once the jumper is fully positioned at the absolute edge of the platform. The crew had just finished tightening Yenya's torso straps and were in the middle of preparing the equipment for her boyfriend, who was fully rigged and ready to go. Suddenly, one of the instructors looked up, gestured toward the edge, and shouted over the roaring wind, "Okay, jump!" The instructor's command was explicitly intended for Yenya's boyfriend. He was the one whose ropes were checked, cleared, and securely locked into the safety system. Yenya, however, was in no state to process context. Hearing the word jump, her panic-stricken brain fired an instantaneous signal. She completely misunderstood the situation, assuming the command was directed at her. She thought her nightmare was finally supposed to end. Before anyone could realize what was happening or reach out a hand to restrain her, Yenya took a decisive, brave step forward and launched herself off the edge of the railway bridge. The horror that followed was instantaneous. The instructors had only put the body harness on her. They had not yet attached the bungee cord to her body or her ankles. The elastic rope was still lying coiled on the wooden floor of the platform. Yenya had leaped into the open air with absolutely nothing connecting her to the bridge. Her boyfriend and the crew could only watch in silent, paralyzed shock as Yenya plummeted like a stone, accelerating rapidly as she fell hundreds of feet down toward the rocky valley below. Her boyfriend immediately threw off his equipment, desperately scrambled off the platform, and began a frantic, terrifying race down the steep, jungle-covered mountainside to reach the bottom of the gorge. When emergency services and her traumatized boyfriend finally located Yenya's body resting in the dense brush at the base of the canyon, medical professionals rushed to her side. Sadly, the immense impact of the fall had killed her, and there was nothing anyone could do. However, the most haunting and tragic detail of the entire event was uncovered days later during the official medical autopsy. When the forensic pathologists completed their examination of her body, they made a shocking discovery. Yenia had not died from the catastrophic physical trauma caused by impacting the ground. Instead, the medical report concluded that Yenia Gomez had suffered a massive fatal heart attack while she was still falling through the air. The sheer terror of the realization had killed her before she ever hit the ground. In those terrifying, weightless seconds of her descent, as the wind rushed past her and the ground zoomed closer, Yenia's mind must have registered the horrific truth. There was no tension pulling at her harness, no elastic cords snapping her back up toward the sky. She realized she was falling completely unprotected. The sudden, overwhelming surge of pure terror and adrenaline was too much for her heart to bear, causing it to fail completely. It remains a deeply heartbreaking reminder of how a single moment of miscommunication, amplified by the crippling weight of human fear, can lead to an irreversible tragedy. In the realm of modern industrial manufacturing, mass-produced food relies heavily on automation, massive machinery, and rigid schedules. In these environments, time is literally money. For large-scale commercial bakeries, a single hour of halted production can result in thousands of dollars in lost revenue, wasted raw ingredients, and delayed shipments to supermarkets. Tragically, when corporate entities prioritize profit margins and production quotas over basic human safety protocols, the consequences are often catastrophic. This was precisely the environment that set the stage for one of the most horrifying industrial workplace accidents in modern British history. The setting was the Fresha Bakery, a large commercial bread-producing facility located in Leicester, England. At the heart of the factory's operations was a massive, industrial tunnel oven. This colossal machine was roughly 80 feet, about 24 meters long, a giant, enclosed metal structure designed to bake thousands of loaves of bread continuously as they moved through its interior on a slow-moving automated conveyor belt. Because of its immense size and insulation, the oven required a massive amount of energy to heat up and, conversely, an incredibly long time to cool down. In May of 1998, a mechanical issue arose inside the giant oven. One of the heavy metal gears that drove the internal conveyor belt had failed, causing a disruption in the baking line. Under standard, legally mandated safety guidelines, the protocol for repairing such a machine was clear and uncompromising. The oven had to be shut down completely, and maintenance crews were required to wait at least 24 hours to allow the massive metal structure to cool down to a safe ambient temperature before anyone could attempt to enter. However, to the management at Fresha Bakery, a 4-hour shutdown was completely unacceptable. The factory was running on a tight schedule, and stopping production for a full day meant losing approximately $1,500 for every single hour the oven sat idle, on top of the steep costs of hiring specialized external technicians. Seeking a shortcut to save both time and money, the factory management devised a highly dangerous, unauthorized plan. Instead of shutting the oven down and waiting for it to cool, they decided to perform the repairs on the fly. They turned off the heavy gas burners and lowered the temperature settings to the absolute minimum, but they left the internal conveyor belt running. The plan required human workers to physically enter the active oven. The management removed a few specific metal plates from the conveyor belt, creating a narrow gap in the track. The strategy was for a worker to crawl through a small maintenance panel on the side of the oven, slide into the narrow gap on the moving conveyor track, and walk slowly in a hunched position inside the dark tunnel. Because the belt was moving forward, the worker would have to constantly walk at the exact same speed as the conveyor, keeping pace with the machine while searching for the broken gear, fixing it, and then riding the belt out to the exit on the other side. To execute this hazardous task, the management looked for volunteers within their own workforce, offering an attractive financial bonus for anyone willing to step inside. 2 experienced factory workers volunteered: 4-year-old Ian Erickson and 7-year-old David Mays. Both men were dedicated employees, and on that particular evening, they had an additional motivation for wanting the job done quickly. There was a highly anticipated football match airing on television later that night, and both Ian and David wanted to finish their shift as early as possible so they could go home and watch the game with their families. Driven by this desire to expedite the process, The two men approached the factory supervisor and asked if they could enter the oven ahead of schedule. The supervisor, eager to get the production line running again, walked over to the side entrance of the massive machine. Instead of looking at the internal temperature gauges or using a proper digital thermometer to verify the actual conditions inside the core of the oven, the supervisor simply placed his bare hand near the air vent. Feeling a stream of cool air from an external ventilation fan blowing near the entrance, he assumed the interior was safe. He gave Ian and David the green light to proceed. Equipped with basic tools and a handheld radio to communicate with the team outside, Ian and David crawled through the small side hatch and stepped into the gap on the moving conveyor belt. Almost immediately, the air hatch was sealed behind them, and they began their slow, forced march through the pitch-black, narrow metal tunnel. For the first few minutes, everything seemed to be going according to plan. But as the conveyor belt carried the two men deeper into the dark, enclosed core of the 80-foot structure, the environment transformed into a literal hell. The supervisor's hand test at the entrance had been entirely deceptive. While the outer edges of the oven were cooled by the fans, the deep center of the massive industrial machine had retained a colossal amount of residual heat. About 5 minutes into the operation, Ian's voice crackled over the handheld radio. He informed the supervisor that the air was becoming uncomfortably warm. The supervisor, downplaying the danger, told them it was normal and urged them to keep moving forward. But within seconds, the temperature plummeted them into a panic. The heat in the core of the oven was radiating violently from the thick metal walls and the floor beneath their feet. "No, it's too hot in here!" Ian screamed into the radio, his voice suddenly filled with sheer terror. "It's incredibly hot, we can't breathe!" Horrified by the desperation in the worker's voice, the manager finally ran over to check the main control panel's digital temperature gauges. To his profound horror, the monitors revealed that the temperature in the center of the oven was resting at well over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, more than 93 degrees Celsius, a temperature hot enough to easily boil water and inflict severe, third-degree burns within seconds. A frantic, chaotic panic erupted outside the oven, but the management quickly realized they had trapped the men in an unrecoverable cage. Because of the oven's design, the massive conveyor belt could only move in one direction. It physically could not be reversed. Furthermore, the tunnel was so incredibly narrow and tightly engineered that Ian and David could not turn around or crawl backward without being instantly caught, crushed, and torn apart by the heavy internal gears and chains surrounding the track. Their only hope of survival was to keep walking forward toward the exit at the far end. However, the conveyor belt moved at an agonizingly slow, automated pace. It took a full 17 minutes for a single section of the belt to travel from the entrance to the exit. For over 10 minutes, the entire factory floor stood in paralyzed horror as the agonizing, desperate screams of Ian and David echoed continuously through the handheld radio. They were being cooked alive in total darkness, unable to escape the suffocating, boiling air. Desperate to save their friends, other factory workers grabbed heavy tools, axes, and crowbars, frantically hammering at the thick, insulated metal exterior of the oven, trying to breach the walls. But the industrial plating was too thick to break. By the time the conveyor belt finally reached the exit hatch, the screams over the radio had completely stopped. When the hatch opened, the rescue crew dragged Ian Erickson out of the machine. The extreme heat had overwhelmed his respiratory system and inflicted catastrophic thermal burns across his entire body. He had died of heat stroke and suffocation seconds before reaching the exit. David Mays, trailing slightly behind, had lost consciousness due to the extreme heat in the center of the oven, collapsed onto the moving track, and was subsequently caught and fatally crushed by the heavy machinery near the exit terminal. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the community and led to a massive investigation by health and safety authorities. The company was found guilty of extreme negligence and corporate manslaughter, receiving massive financial penalties, while the individual managers faced severe legal repercussions. The heartbreaking loss of Ian and David remains a grim, definitive example of the horrific cost of corporate greed, serving as a permanent warning of what happens when human lives are compromised for the sake of industrial efficiency. The forces of nature are often perceived as slow, predictable, and distant. We walk on paved roads, park our cars on solid concrete, and trust that the ground beneath our feet is unyielding. However, beneath the surface of our modern cities lies a complex, invisible network of infrastructure that, when combined with natural geological processes, can transform a mundane afternoon into a waking nightmare. Among all the sudden geological hazards, few are as terrifying or as inescapable as the sinkhole. By definition, a sinkhole is a massive depression or hole in the ground caused by some form of collapse of the surface layer. Most commonly, they form when water either from heavy rainfall, natural underground rivers, or ruptured internal water mains slowly dissolves the soluble bedrock layer, such as limestone or salt beds, underneath the soil. Over months or years, the water hollows out immense, vacant caverns beneath the earth, leaving only a thin, fragile crust of topsoil and asphalt above. To anyone walking on the surface, everything looks perfectly normal. But underneath, there is nothing but an empty, echoing void. When the weight on the surface finally exceeds the structural strength of that remaining thin crust, the ground breaks open instantly. If an unfortunate individual happens to fall into a large sinkhole, their chances of survival are astronomically low. Unlike a regular pit, the ground inside a sinkhole after the initial implosion does not remain stable. It continues to sink, crumble, and churn like a massive vortex of quicksand beneath one's feet. Even if a victim manages to scramble to the sides of the chasm, escaping is physically impossible. The surrounding soil is completely loose, wet, and unstable, offering absolutely no handholds or traction. You are essentially trapped in a shifting, subterranean cage that slowly pulls you deeper into the earth. Fortunately, most natural sinkholes form gradually, giving geological experts and local residents plenty of warning signs, such as cracked foundations, tilted trees, or small depressions in the dirt. But when human engineering fails beneath the streets, a sinkhole can appear out of nowhere in the blink of an eye. This is precisely what happened in the heart of winter in the Russian Federation. To understand the unique horror of the disaster that unfolded, one must understand how modern Russian cities survive the brutal sub-zero winter months. In many parts of Russia, individual residential and commercial buildings do not have their own independent heating furnaces. Instead, municipalities rely on a centralized district heating system. Massive industrial municipal plants boil colossal volumes of water and pump it through a vast, sprawling network of heavy-duty underground pipes directly into businesses, schools, and apartment complexes across the city. This water is not merely warm, it is pushed through the grid at boiling temperatures, radiating intense heat to keep entire communities from freezing to death. On the morning of the 19th of November 2019, in the Russian city of Penza, a historic industrial hub located approximately 340 miles south of Moscow, this vital life-saving infrastructure turned into a weapon of mass destruction. Deep beneath the asphalt of a busy local grocery store car park, a massive, high-pressure central heating pipe suddenly burst. Initially, nobody in the area had any idea that a catastrophic failure had occurred. The rupture happened several meters underground, hidden entirely from view. However, thousands of gallons of pressurized boiling water began to erupt from the broken pipe, violently washing away the packed sand, dirt, and stone foundation supporting the parking lot above. Within hours, the boiling torrent had carved out a massive hollow cavern directly beneath the asphalt. As the morning progressed, a few local witnesses walking past the car park noticed something unusual. Thin, ghostly plumes of white steam were gently rising from the cracks in the asphalt near the parked cars. In the freezing Russian winter air, however, seeing steam or heat radiating from underground vents was a common sight. None of the bystanders thought anything of it. They assumed it was a minor, routine venting of the city's heating system. No one mullah suspected that the solid-looking asphalt of the parking lot was now nothing more than a fragile, hollow shell suspended over a roaring reservoir of boiling water and liquid mud. A short time later, a gray Lotta Largus station wagon pulled into the car park. Inside the vehicle were two local men aged 49 and 53 who had driven to the store to run a few ordinary daily errands. The driver navigated the vehicle through the lot looking for an open space and slowly steered the car directly toward the area where the steam was rising. The moment the heavy front tires of the Lada rolled onto that specific patch of asphalt, the fragile crust completely gave way under the vehicle's weight. The ground did not just crack, it imploded violently. In a fraction of a second, a massive, gaping sinkhole tore open beneath the car. The front of the Lada dropped instantly into the abyss, and the entire vehicle flipped forward, plunging upside down into a deep chasm filled to the brim with raging, churning water that had reached temperatures of over 170 degrees Fahrenheit, 75 degrees Celsius. The horror of the situation was immediate and absolute. The vehicle was completely submerged in the boiling pit, and the impact of the fall jammed the car doors tightly against the crumbling, shifting walls of the sinkhole. Terrified, bystanders rushed toward the edge of the pit, desperate to help, but they were instantly driven back by the suffocating waves of intense heat and scalding steam erupting from the hole. The boiling water quickly flooded the interior cabin of the trapped car. By the time emergency rescue services arrived at the scene with heavy cranes and specialized thermal suits, it was already too late. The churning, unstable nature of the sinkhole made the extraction process incredibly dangerous, as the edges of the pavement continued to collapse into the water. When workers finally managed to hook the vehicle and hoist the crushed Lada out of the steaming crater, they made a heartbreaking discovery. Both men inside had succumbed to severe thermal trauma and drowning within minutes of the initial collapse. The Penza sinkhole disaster remains a deeply chilling example of how quickly and quietly the ordinary world can collapse beneath us. It stands as a tragic testament to the invisible dangers hidden within our industrial societies, where a simple drive to the grocery store can end in a sudden, inescapable struggle against a boiling abyss. In the realm of modern music history, there are very few artists who truly lived the brutal realities they sang about. For Rosalino Chelino Sanchez, the pioneer of narcocorridos drug ballads, authenticity was not a marketing strategy, it was a blood-soaked reality. By the early 1990s, Chelino had transformed from a poor immigrant, fleeing a vendetta in Sinaloa, Mexico, into the undisputed king of underground Mexican music in the United States. His raw, unpolished voice resonated deeply with millions of working-class immigrants and youth who found solace in his gritty stories of smugglers, outlaws, and cartel violence. However, singing about the criminal underworld is an inherently lethal profession. In the highly volatile world of narcocorridos, immortalizing one cartel boss in a song meant instantly making an enemy of a rival faction. Chelino was fully aware that he was walking through a minefield with every performance. He knew that many of his songs had angered dangerous men, and he lived with the constant lingering knowledge that an assassination attempt was not a matter of if, but okay. Because of this ever-present danger, Chelino made it a strict personal rule never to travel unprotected. Whenever he stepped out in public or walked onto a concert stage, he carried a loaded semi-automatic handgun tucked discreetly into his waistband. This lethal convergence of music and violence reached a terrifying climax on the night of the 25th of January 1992. Chelino was scheduled to perform a highly anticipated concert at the Plaza Los Arcos, a popular nightclub in Coachella, California. The venue was completely sold out, packed to the brim with over 1,000 passionate fans who had gathered to drink, dance, and see their idol perform live. The energy in the club was electric, the air thick with anticipation as the backing band struck up the traditional brass and accordion melodies. Chelino walked onto the stage to a roaring ovation. Wearing his signature cowboy hat and a sharp suit, he immediately commanded the room. He began singing his famous ballads, his distinct, raspy voice echoing through the crowded venue. For the first part of the night, the concert was a massive success. The crowd sang along to every word, raising their glasses to the man who gave a voice to the outlaws. But hidden deep within the dense crowd of 1,000 fans was a man named Eduardo Gallegos. Gallegos was a local 32-year-old unemployed man with a history of volatile behavior. He had not come to the club to enjoy the music. He had arrived with a specific, deadly objective. Tucked away in his jacket was a loaded .25 caliber pistol. Around midnight, in the middle of Cellino's performance, Gallegos suddenly broke away from the crowd. Pushing past unsuspecting bystanders, he aggressively scrambled up onto the elevated stage, breaching the thin line of security. Before the band members or the audience could even comprehend what was happening, Gallegos marched directly toward Cellino, pulled out his handgun, and pointed it straight at the singer's chest. What happened next would permanently cement Cellino Sanchez's name into the annals of folklore. In a situation where almost any ordinary person would have panicked, frozen in fear, or begged for mercy, Cellino's survival instincts, forged in the violent streets of Sinaloa, instantly kicked in. He did not flinch, duck, or attempt to run away. Instead, as Gallegos pulled his trigger, Cellino displayed an almost supernatural level of composure. At the exact same moment the assassin fired, Cellino reached into his own waistband, pulled out his 9mm pistol, and began returning fire at point-blank range. The nightclub instantly exploded into pure, unadulterated chaos. The upbeat, festive music screeched to a sudden halt as the deafening, sharp cracks of real gunfire echoed through the speakers. A violent, chaotic gun battle erupted directly on the stage. Gallegos fired his weapon repeatedly, and one of his initial rounds tore through Cellino's torso, critically wounding the singer. Despite being shot and losing blood rapidly, Cellino stood his ground, maintaining his grip on his weapon and continuing to unleash a barrage of bullets at his attacker. Seeing their idol under fire, several brave members of the audience and Cellino's personal entourage rushed the stage. A frantic, desperate struggle ensued as they attempted to tackle and disarm Gallegos. During the wild close-quarters melee, weapons continued to discharge erratically. One of the loose firearms was grabbed by an associate who accidentally fired into the crowd, further amplifying the horror. Down on the floor of the nightclub, pure panic took over. 1,000 terrified, screaming fans scrambled over tables and chairs, desperately stampeding toward the exit doors to escape the crossfire. People threw themselves onto the floor, shielding their loved ones as bullets whistled through the air. When the smoke finally cleared and the police arrived at the bloody scene, the true scale of the carnage became apparent. Eduardo Gallegos had been shot multiple times by Cellino and was quickly tackled to the ground by the crowd, who severely beat him before handover to the authorities. Cellino Sanchez was slumped on the stage, bleeding profusely from a near-fatal gunshot wound to his abdomen. The erratic, stray bullets flying off the stage had struck several innocent bystanders. In total, 8 people were wounded, and tragically, a 20-year-old man named Claudio Renova was struck by a stray bullet and killed instantly. Cellino was rushed to a nearby hospital in critical condition. For several days, he hovered on the brink of death, undergoing emergency surgeries to repair the severe internal damage caused by the assassin's bullet. Ultimately, his strength prevailed, and he survived the horrific ordeal. The Coachella incident was a massive turning point. In the corporate music industry, a chaotic shootout that leaves a bystander dead would usually destroy an artist's career, making them too dangerous for venues to book. But in the world of narco-corridos, the event had the exact opposite effect. It did not ruin Cellino. It turned him into a living god. He was no longer just a musician singing poetic stories about dangerous outlaws. He was a real-world outlaw who had stood face-to-face with an assassin on a public stage, drawn his own weapon, and fought for his life in a blaze of glory. He had lived the very violence that defined his art. His album sales skyrocketed, and his legendary status became completely untouchable. Tragically, this intense fame also painted an even larger target on his back, setting off the final countdown toward his ultimate assassination in Sinaloa just 4 months later. The Coachella shootout remains a terrifying, definitive moment where the illusion of entertainment shattered, exposing the deadly reality behind the music. In the study of aviation disasters, investigators often look at mechanical failures, severe weather, or structural defects to explain why a tragedy occurred. But occasionally, a catastrophe happens in perfect conditions, driven entirely by human miscommunication and visual illusion. The mid-air collision involving Pacific Southwest Airlines PSA Flight 182 over San Diego on the 25th of September 1978 is one such event. While the radar tracks and flight paths tell the technical story of how a Boeing 727 and a tiny Cessna 172 collided, the true, heartbreaking reality of the disaster is preserved inside the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, the black box that captured the final words, decisions, and emotions of the crew and passengers. To understand the atmosphere inside the cockpit before the chaos, one must realize how comfortable the crew felt. Captain James McFerrin and First Officer Robert Fox flew this regional route frequently. The morning was exceptionally clear, and because they were flying under Visual Flight Rules, VFR, they felt entirely in control. They were laughing, chatting with off-duty PSA employees who were hitching a ride in the cockpit's extra jump seats, and preparing for a routine landing at Lindbergh Field. The first shift in atmosphere occurred when air traffic control warned them about a small Cessna in their vicinity. First Officer Fox spotted a plane, reported it, and the crew went back to their landing checklists. What they did not know was that they had spotted the wrong aircraft. The real Cessna 172, flown by a student pilot and his instructor, was climbing directly ahead of them, moving much slower than the commercial jet. Because the Boeing 727 was descending with its nose pitched upward, the Cessna completely disappeared into a blind spot beneath the cockpit floor. As the jet closed the distance from behind, a subtle anxiety began to ripple through the cockpit. The crew couldn't see the Cessna anymore. The black box recorded the pilots trying to reassure themselves. "I think he's passed off to our right," Captain McFerrin muttered, searching the blue sky. "Yeah," First Officer Fox responded, though his voice lacked conviction. A few seconds later, a voice from one of the off-duty employees in the jump seat quietly noted the danger of the busy airspace, stating, "There's a lot of traffic out there. It's a busy place," the captain agreed. The tension was low, but the uncertainty was there. They assumed the plane was gone, but they didn't know. Instead of double-checking with radar controllers, they pressed forward. That silent gap in certainty proved fatal. At exactly 9:47 a.m., a violent, deafening crunch reverberated through the aircraft. The belly of the Boeing 727 slammed over the top of the Cessna at 2,600 feet. The impact was catastrophic. The small plane disintegrated, tearing open the structural framework of the Boeing's right wing and severing all internal hydraulic lines. Instantly, the entire atmosphere inside the cockpit shattered. The relaxed, professional environment vanished, replaced by an absolute cacophony of emergency alarms. The master caution lights flashed red, and the mechanical stick shaker began to violently vibrate the pilot's control wheels, warning them that the aircraft was losing aerodynamic lift. Because the hydraulic fluid was spraying out into the open air, the controls went completely slack. The giant airliner rolled heavily to the right and pitched forward into a terrifying, near-vertical dive toward a residential neighborhood below. In those final 30 seconds, as gravity pulled everything forward and the wind roared outside the cracked structure, the flight crew demonstrated incredible psychological resilience. There was no screaming, no wild panic, and no breakdown of order. Captain McFerrin and First Officer Fox fought with all their physical strength to pull back on the control columns, desperately trying to get the nose of the plane up. "What have we got here?" Fox asked, his muscles straining against the unresponsive controls. "We're hit, man. We're hit," McFerrin responded, his voice remarkably focused. Realizing the aircraft was completely unresponsive, McFerrin kept his finger on the radio trigger. He did not want the world to wonder what had happened. He keyed his microphone to inform the control tower of their fate. "Tower, we're going down. This is PSA," he reported calmly. Inside the main cabin, the 128 passengers were suddenly thrown into a living nightmare. The plane was diving at an angle so steep that the windows showed nothing but the roofs of houses and streets rushing up at over 300 miles per hour. The immense G-forces made it difficult to move. Luggage tore free from overhead bins, and the cabin was filled with the terrifying sound of rushing air and the roar of the burning right wing. Yet, even in the face of certain death, the human spirit looked for connection. In those final 15 seconds, passengers clung to the hands of strangers or loved ones sitting next to them. Some began to pray silently, while others tried to comfort terrified children. Back in the cockpit, the flight engineer struggled to manage the failing engines. The captain, looking through the front windshield, saw the residential streets of North Park zooming closer. He knew there was nothing left to do. The mechanical struggle was over, and only the human moment remained. Trying to bring a shred of comfort to his dying crew and the machine they loved, Captain McFerrin muttered his final famous words to the airplane. "Easy, baby." It was a phrase used by veteran pilots to gently coax an aircraft out of a rough maneuver, a final, tragic sign of affection for the grinning bird that was about to die. Just 3 seconds before the impact, as the shadows of houses engulfed the cockpit windows, the CVR captured one final heartbreaking sound from the cabin area. An unknown voice, perhaps an off-duty pilot or a flight attendant opening the cockpit door, shouted a final message into the void. "I love you, Mom." At 9:02 a.m., the Boeing 727 slammed directly into the intersection of Dwight and Niles streets. The kinetic energy of the 300 mph impact completely pulverized the aircraft, creating a massive explosion that shook the entire city of San Diego. All 144 lives were extinguished in a fraction of a second. The physical wreckage was cleared away long ago, but the audio recording of those final 30 seconds remains a permanently chilling monument to the tragedy, a deeply moving record of professional bravery, tragic resignation, and the enduring power of human love at the literal edge of existence. The human body is an extraordinary, resilient machine, equipped with sophisticated survival mechanisms that have evolved over millions of years. When faced with an immediate life-threatening danger, our brain triggers an instantaneous command known as the fight-or-flight response. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream, the pupils dilate to take in more light, breathing quickens to oxygenate the muscles, and the heart pumps violently to prepare the body to either battle the threat or run away from it. It is an evolutionary masterpiece designed to keep us alive. However, like any high-powered system, there is a breaking point. When the mind is subjected to a level of pure, absolute terror that it cannot comprehend or escape, that very same survival mechanism can backfire, transforming our biological defenses into a fatal weapon. This profound and terrifying psychological phenomenon is at the absolute core of Yenia Gomez's tragedy on the abandoned railway bridge in Amaga, Colombia. To fully comprehend the horror of her final moments, one must look beyond the physical sequence of events and examine the sheer, devastating power of human fear. Yenia was a young analytical lawyer whose mind was trained to seek order, logic, and predictability. Yet, she carried a severe, debilitating phobia of heights. A phobia is not just a rational dislike, it is an intense, irrational dread that paralyzes the nervous system. When Yenya agreed to accompany her boyfriend bungee jumping in July of 2021, she was attempting an act of extreme psychological exposure. She wanted to confront her monster head-on. But a phobia cannot be reasoned with, and the environment at the bridge shattered her mental defenses before she ever stepped onto the platform. The multi-hour delay on the crowded bridge acted as a slow drip poison to her nervous system. As she stood over the massive chasm watching others drop into the abyss, her body was already locked in an uncontrollable panic attack. Her heart was racing at maximum capacity for hours, depleting her body's natural reserves of calm. By the time her name was called, Yenya was no longer operating on logic. She was experiencing severe tunnel vision and auditory exclusion, a psychological state where the brain, overwhelmed by terror, shuts down peripheral awareness. The roaring wind, the visual depth of the gorge, and the chaotic sounds of the crowd blurred into a single, terrifying sensory overload. Her mind was screaming for an escape, desperate to get the ordeal over with. when the instructor shouted, "Okay, jump!" a command meant solely for her fully secured boyfriend. Yenia's hyper-focused, panic-stricken brain registered only one thing. It was time to leap into the void to make the terror stop. She stepped off the wooden ledge and launched herself into the open air. But the elastic bungee cord had not been attached to her body. She was falling completely unprotected. What happens to the human mind and body during a definitive, unprotected fall from hundreds of feet in the air? In aviation and extreme sports accidents, this interval is referred to as the descent phase, a brief, agonizing window of time where a conscious individual realizes with absolute certainty that they are going to die. For Yenya Gomez, this descent lasted only a matter of 4 to 5 seconds. But inside the theater of her mind, those few seconds stretched out into an eternity of pure, unadulterated horror. As she left the platform, Yenya expected to feel the familiar, reassuring tug of the heavy harness tightening around her chest or ankles. She expected the violent, elastic recoil of the bungee rope to snap her safely back upward toward the sky. Instead, there was only the weightless, frictionless sensation of a terminal freefall. The wind roared past her ears, and the green jungle canopy and jagged rocks of the riverbed zoomed toward her at an accelerating pace of nearly 100 miles per hour. In that precise fraction of a second, the illusion of safety vanished. Yenia's conscious mind registered the ultimate horror. There was no cord. She was completely detached from the bridge, falling helplessly to her death. The physiological response to this realization was immediate and catastrophic. Pathologists and forensic scientists who study sudden death from fear note that when a person realizes they are in a completely inescapable fatal situation, the brain's amygdala sends a massive, unprecedented panic signal to the adrenal glands. The body releases a colossal, toxic surge of adrenaline and catecholamines, stress hormones, directly into the cardiovascular system. This massive chemical tidal wave hits the heart like a physical blow. The sudden influx of adrenaline forces the heart muscle to contract so violently and rapidly that it can no longer pump blood efficiently. The heart enters a chaotic, lethal rhythm known as ventricular fibrillation. The muscular walls of the heart begin to quiver helplessly instead of beating, causing blood pressure to instantly drop to zero. The brain is starved of oxygen, and consciousness fades. When the forensic team performed the official autopsy on Yenya's body, they expected to find that her death was caused by the massive deceleration trauma of impacting the rocky ground at the bottom of the gorge. Instead, the medical examiners made a startling and deeply haunting discovery. Her lungs and internal cardiovascular structures showed definitive signs that her heart had completely failed prior to impact. The profound, overwhelming terror of her realization had physically broken her heart while she was still suspended in midair. Her mind had processed a level of fear so immense that the body chose to shut down completely rather than endure the final impact. The story of Yenya Gomez is frequently cited as a tragic cautionary tale regarding industrial negligence and safety communication. But on a deeper, more profound level, it serves as an incredibly dark and thought-provoking study of the limits of human endurance. It proves that our emotions are not merely abstract thoughts. They are powerful, tangible forces that dictate our physical reality. Yenya did not die from the gravity of the earth, nor did she die from the stone below. She was killed by the sheer weight of her own realization, leaving behind a haunting legacy that reminds us that sometimes the ultimate limits of human fear can be just as lethal as a physical blow. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the afternoon of the 10th of April, 1998, a 40-year-old woman named Diane Auget stood at a bar inside the Hayloft Tavern. It was a small local spot in Hudson, Florida. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, or at least they think they do. Diane held a glass in her hand. She brought it to her lips and downed the last few sips of her drink. Her vision was starting to get blurry, and a wave of nausea rolled through her stomach. But she didn't care. In fact, that was kind of the point. She yelled out to the bartender, her voice slurred and thick, telling him to bring her another round. She wanted to get so drunk that she could forget everything. Because right then, her life felt like a complete disaster. It hadn't always been this way. Not too long ago, Diane had been a married stay-at-home mother. She had 3 kids, and they were her entire world. She loved them more than anything. But about 10 years before this night at the bar, her life had taken a very difficult turn. She started having very serious mental health problems. After a long and difficult process, she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. It was a heavy diagnosis, one that came with a whole new set of challenges. She would fall into these deep, dark depressions. They were so powerful, they would make it almost impossible for her to function, to even get out of bed in the morning. Then, like a switch would flip, she would swing into these intense manic episodes. These would keep her awake for days on end, leaving her so delirious and exhausted that she would start talking to herself, seeing things that weren't there. Living with this was incredibly hard, not just for Diane, but for her family. Eventually, the strain became too much. Her husband divorced her, and in the custody battle that followed, he was awarded full custody of their children. Losing her kids, even if she understood why, was a blow that Diane never fully recovered from. By 1998, her life had sort of leveled off into a new, difficult normal. She was living with her sister, which provided some support and a roof over her head. But her bipolar disorder was far from under control. She had medication for it, but she wasn't always consistent about taking it. So, the cycles continued. The crushing lows of depression, followed by the chaotic highs of mania. She had been in and out of various psychiatric facilities more times than her family could count. Each time, they hoped it would be the one that finally helped her find stability. But it never seemed to stick. So, on this particular night, April 10th, Diane was in a dark place. She just wanted to numb the pain, to drown her sorrows, and make the world go quiet for a little while. A couple of hours earlier, she had left her sister's house. She didn't say where she was going. She didn't own a car, so she just started walking. Her feet eventually carried her to the Hayloft Tavern. And for the past couple of hours, she had been standing there, mostly by herself, pacing in circles and drinking alone. Just then, the bartender came back over to her side of the bar. Diane was seeing double, but she could clearly see that he wasn't carrying another drink for her. His hands were empty. He had a look on his face that was half annoyed, half sympathetic. He told her he was cutting her off, that she'd had enough. Diane was furious. The feeling of humiliation washed over her. She started to argue with him, telling him he didn't know what he was talking about, that she was fine. But the bartender just held up his hands and stood his ground. He was sorry, he said, but she was cut off. There was a finality in his voice. Defeated and angry, Diane turned and stumbled out of the bar, disappearing into the Florida night. The next day, April 11th, Diane's mother, Mildred, was pacing back and forth inside her living room. She held a phone pressed tightly to her ear, listening to it ring. After a couple of rings, a dispatcher from the local police department answered. In a shaky voice, Mildred told them she needed to report her daughter, Diane, as a missing person. A little while earlier, Mildred had gotten a call from her other daughter, the one Diane was living with. She said that Diane had left the house the night before and still hadn't come home. She hadn't called, hadn't left a note, nothing. Given Diane's history of mental illness and her often erratic behavior, Mildred's mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. She felt a deep, cold pit of fear in her stomach. Her daughter had to be in some kind of trouble. On the phone with the police dispatcher, Mildred explained the whole situation. She said that yes, it was possible that Diane had just left on her own for some reason. But it was just as possible, if not more so, that she was having a manic episode. When that happened, Diane could become disoriented. She might have wandered off and gotten lost, with no idea how to get back home. The dispatcher was calm and professional. She assured Mildred that she would send officers to interview her and her other daughter right away. They would start looking for Diane immediately. But 4 days went by. 4 long, agonizing days. And on April 15th, there was still no sign of Diane. That afternoon, Mildred went down to the police station. It was a trip she had made every single day since her daughter had disappeared, hoping for any scrap of news. But just like all the other days, the police didn't have any new information for her. They told her what little they knew, which wasn't much. They had confirmed that on the night of April 10th, after leaving her sister's house, Diane had gone to the Hayloft Tavern. They spoke to the bartender, who confirmed he had cut her off because she was incredibly drunk. He said she had walked out of the bar, and that was the last he saw of her. Investigators had also found a couple of people who had seen Diane the following day, on April 11th. She had been sighted walking along Highway 19, which was just a couple of miles away from the tavern. Another witness spotted her near a locally owned motel right off the highway, a place called the Coral Sands Motel. But after that, the trail went cold. The police told Mildred they had no idea what happened to Diane after that. They didn't know where she could have gone or what could have happened to her. Mildred left the police station feeling a profound sense of disappointment and fear. The drive home was a blur. Her mind was racing, playing out all the terrible possibilities. Was her daughter hiding somewhere on purpose? Had she gotten lost and was now hurt, hungry, and alone? Or had she run into the wrong person? Had she been kidnapped? Or worse? These scenarios tormented her, each one more terrifying than the last. Finally, she pulled into her driveway and went inside. She sat down on her couch, exhausted, and tried to think about what she could possibly do next. And that's when she noticed it. The little red light on her answering machine was blinking. She had a new voicemail. Mildred thought maybe it was her other daughter, calling with an update while she was out. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something to do with Diane. She got up, walked over to the machine, and pressed the play button. What she heard next made her blood run cold. It was Diane's voice, and she sounded absolutely terrified. Through the static of the machine, Mildred could hear her daughter crying out, "Help. Let me out." Then there was a scuffling sound on the recording, like someone had grabbed the phone away from Diane. Mildred heard Diane say something like, "Hey, give me that," and then the call just cut off. The line went dead. After hearing the message, Mildred went into a total panic. Her worst fears were no longer just possibilities in her head. They felt real. It sounded like her daughter was in terrible immediate danger. Shaking with anxiety and fear, she grabbed the answering machine and looked at the small display for the caller ID, desperate to see who had left this horrifying message. But all it said was that the call had come in from a place called Starlight. The name meant nothing to Mildred. She quickly dialed the number back, her heart pounding in her chest, praying that someone would pick up. But no one answered. The phone just rang and rang. With trembling hands, Mildred called the police. This voicemail changed everything. It was now obvious to the police that Diane hadn't just left on purpose, and she wasn't just lost. Based on that recording, it sounded like she had been kidnapped and was being held somewhere against her will. But the question was, where? The police had no idea. They tried to trace the call, but they couldn't pinpoint a specific location. And they couldn't figure out what Starlight was either. Was it a business? A nickname for a location? They had no leads. So, for another full day, despite this terrifying new clue, the investigation stalled. There just wasn't much to go on. That is, until the next afternoon. On April 16th, 5 days after Diane had disappeared, the police got a call. It was from a man who said he had just been walking along the side of Highway 19. He told the dispatcher he had found something disturbing lying in the grass. He said he wasn't even sure if the object was real, but it looked so troubling that he thought the police should come and check it out, just in case. Police immediately rushed out to the location. They met the man, who showed them what he had found. The officers carefully collected the object and sent it off to the crime lab for testing. Then they waited. When the analysis came back, they learned 2 things. First, the object was definitely real. And second, it belonged to Diane Augat. It was the severed tip of her finger from her right hand. Over the next few years, the case of Diane Auget grew colder but stranger. People would occasionally call in sightings of her to the police in Florida. Investigators looked into every single tip. They interviewed more than 100 people, chasing down every possible lead. But nothing ever panned out. The police never figured out what Starlight was, the mysterious place where that desperate voicemail had originated. And they never determined how or why Diane's finger was cut off and left by the side of the highway. But despite the lack of answers, strange clues that were definitely tied to Diane kept turning up in the most bizarre places. For example, the manager of a convenience store near where Diane lived found a plastic bag inside their store's outdoor freezer. Inside the bag were Diane's clothes, all neatly folded. Who would put them there, and why? Another time, a customer at a different nearby convenience store found another plastic bag that had been left behind on a countertop. This bag was full of toiletries, including eyeliner, perfume, and lipstick. And on the outside of the bag, scrawled in marker, was the name Diane. Police were never able to figure out who placed either of the bags or what they were supposed to mean. Unfortunately, today, more than 2 decades later, Diane's case remains unsolved. Her family has never stopped looking for answers. Around 3:30 inches the afternoon on the 17th of December, 1927, a 21-year-old sailor named Joe Stevens stood inside a U.S. Navy submarine. The vessel was cruising silently underwater in Cape Cod Bay, about a mile off the coast of Massachusetts. Joe was at the very front of the submarine, stationed inside a small, windowless compartment known as the torpedo room. It was about 20 feet long and 10 feet wide. On one side, a heavy metal door stood open, leading out to the rest of the sub. The walls of the room were lined with 6 bunks for the crew, a tangled mess of machinery, and several long, menacing torpedoes. Despite the cramped and dark conditions, Joe was absolutely thrilled to be there. Working on a submarine had been his dream for as long as he could remember. When he was just a little kid, he had actually built his own periscope out of a piece of wood. A periscope on a real submarine is like a long set of binoculars that can be raised up from the sub. It allows the crew to be just below the surface of the water, hidden from view, while the periscope pokes just barely out of the water to see what's going on around them. With this fake wooden periscope, Joe and his older sister, Florence, would spend hours and hours pretending they were on a submarine deep underwater, going on all sorts of secret and important missions. So, years later, when Joe turned 18, remember, the very first thing he did was enlist in the Navy. And just recently, he had finally been assigned to work on this exact submarine. For Joe, it was literally his childhood dream coming true. On this particular day, Joe was taking part in one of his very first test sails. The mission was simple. He and the other 40 men on board were just running through drills, testing all the different machinery to make sure everything was in perfect working order. Joe and 5 other men had been assigned to the torpedo room. They were standing by, waiting for a command from their captain to come through on the one-way intercom system overhead. But as they were standing there, waiting in the quiet hum of the submarine, something happened. Out of nowhere, Joe heard a loud, grating, metallic sound. It echoed through the entire submarine, a horrible screech of metal against metal. The sub itself shook so violently from the impact that Joe and the other men were thrown off their feet, falling hard to the metal floor. Immediately, Joe and his coworkers scrambled to get up. They looked at each other with wide, confused eyes, all thinking the same thing. What was that? But before they could even say a word, their worst nightmare began to unfold. A torrent of seawater began to rush through that open door, flooding in from the rest of the submarine and into the torpedo room. As this absolutely horrifying scenario was playing out, Joe's immediate reaction was a strange and overwhelming sense of déjà vu. For just a split second, he felt like he had experienced this exact moment before. But before he could even process that bizarre feeling, a couple of his coworkers rushed past him. They managed to get to the door that connected the torpedo room to the rest of the submarine, and with all their strength, they slammed it shut and sealed it tight. At that point, Joe was snapped back to reality. He wasn't thinking about the feeling of déjà vu anymore. He was focused on what was happening. He realized there must have been some kind of terrible accident. Everyone in the room thought the same thing. That horrible grating sound, the shaking, the rushing water, it could only mean one thing. Something had struck their submarine. He expected to hear the captain's voice come over the intercom at any second, not to continue the test run, but with urgent orders about what they should do now that a real-world emergency was happening. And so, for a couple of minutes, Joe and his 5 fellow sailors just sat there in the now sealed-off torpedo room, waiting in silence for that announcement. But there was nothing. Just the sound of their own breathing and the faint creaks of the submarine. And then they all felt a final, heavy jolt, as if the entire submarine had just settled at the bottom of the bay. At first, Joe and the 5 other sailors didn't panic. They knew that whatever had happened was not good. It was serious. But they figured it wasn't a total catastrophe just yet. It was bad, but maybe they could be saved. After all, they were only about a mile away from the nearest Coast Guard station. And even though Joe and the others inside the torpedo room had no way to communicate with the outside world from where they were, they assumed that someone in the other parts of the submarine would be able to send out a distress call to the Coast Guard. They figured help was already on its way. But the minutes slowly turned into hours. And there was no progress. There was no sign that any sort of rescue was underway. They heard nothing over the intercom. They couldn't even hear any sounds from the other side of the sealed door. They thought that by now, surely one of their comrades would have come over and knocked or tried to talk to them in some way. But there was only silence. To make matters worse, the emergency lights inside the torpedo room eventually flickered and died, plunging them into total darkness. They were trapped at the bottom of the bay in a sealed metal room with no light. They also had no food and no water. All the supplies were in the other part of the submarine, but they couldn't risk opening the door. More water could come rushing in. They were completely and utterly trapped. All of that was horrible, but the scariest part of the whole situation was something they all knew but didn't want to say out loud. There was a finite amount of oxygen inside that sealed room. And with every single breath they took, they were using up that precious air supply. Pretty soon, that tiny metal torpedo room started to feel less like a part of a submarine and more like an underwater coffin. Joe began fading in and out of sleep. He lost all track of time in the endless dark. And with each passing hour, he was starting to lose hope. But then, suddenly, Joe heard a sound. It was a loud, metallic, clanging sound. He realized someone was knocking on the outside of the submarine. Their rescue had begun. Joe and the others immediately jumped out of their bunks, knocking into each other in the pitch-black room. They scrambled over to the hull of the sub and began knocking back, signaling to whoever was out there that they were alive. They were still in there. By using Morse code, which is a method of communication that uses a series of taps, Joe was able to have a conversation with the people outside. He confirmed that they were Coast Guard rescue divers. And they told Joe what had happened. They explained that about 16 hours earlier, a Coast Guard ship had accidentally struck their submarine. The collision had punctured the hull, and the submarine had sunk to the bottom. Everyone else on board, besides Joe and the 5 men with him in the torpedo room, had drowned. When Joe and the others heard this news, it was horrifying. But at the same time, they were hit with a wave of relief. Had they not sealed that door as fast as they did, they would be dead too. They were so incredibly lucky to be alive. So, after hearing this message, Joe began frantically knocking back a new message. He basically said, well, that's great, but when are you going to get us out of here? He explained that they were running out of air, that it was getting harder and harder to breathe. But the rescue divers could only tell him that they were doing their best. They would get them up as soon as they possibly could. And this was true. The Coast Guard was genuinely doing everything they could to save them. But the reality was, this was a really, really difficult problem. You have 6 people trapped inside a small air pocket deep underwater. If you try to open any part of the submarine, the immense pressure of the ocean would cause water to rush in so quickly that it would kill everyone inside instantly. So that wasn't an option. You also had the ticking clock. As Joe had said, they were running out of air. This meant there was a very compressed timeline to figure this out. So really, the only option was to somehow lift the entire submarine with everyone still inside and raise it to the surface. But this was 1927. This would be a complicated thing to do even with modern technology, let alone nearly 100 years ago. But it was their best and only chance. The plan was to bring in multiple ships with different kinds of heavy-duty lifts and somehow scoop up the submarine and bring it to the surface before everyone inside suffocated. But there was another problem. Just as they began to organize all these ships, a huge storm rolled in. The surface of the ocean was now being battered by extremely high winds, making it nearly impossible to position the ships and their lifting equipment. And unfortunately, the weather forecast said this storm was going to rage for days. While this catastrophe was playing out off the coast of Massachusetts, about 100 miles away in Providence, Rhode Island, Joe's older sister, Florence, opened up a newspaper. She read yet another article about the sunken submarine where she knew her little brother was trapped. For the last couple of days, Florence had been absolutely glued to her radio and the newspapers, desperate for any piece of good news. But every article, every news segment, said the same thing. The 6 men trapped inside the sub were still alive. They were communicating with the divers. But the storm on the surface was still too intense to rescue them. Florence felt so scared for her brother, and it wasn't just because the situation itself was so dangerous. It was because she remembered the submarine game that she and Joe used to play when they were little. More specifically, she remembered the very last time they ever played it. Joe had been about 4 years old. The two of them had just finished another one of their make-believe missions, and they were supposed to be bringing their imaginary submarine back up to the surface. But then, Joe had suddenly dropped his homemade wooden periscope. He turned to Florence and said something so strange and so haunting for such a young child that Florence had never forgotten it. She had asked him to explain what he meant, but he had refused. In fact, after that day, he refused to play the submarine game ever again. Now, Florence hadn't thought about that strange moment in years. But now, seeing what was happening to her brother, it was all she could think about. A couple of days later, on December 22nd, 5 days after the submarine had sunk, Florence received the official word. Her brother Joe and all the other sailors trapped in the torpedo room had died while waiting to be rescued. Florence was completely grief-stricken. This was her baby brother, and he had just died in this horrible, drawn-out way. But also, strangely, for the first time in her life, she felt like she actually understood what Joe had said all those years ago when he was just 4 years old when they had played that last game of submarine. On that day, after dropping his periscope, he had turned to Florence and said, quote, "All hands were lost." It's an expression used in the Navy to mean that everybody on board a ship has died. He was saying their make-believe submarine had just sunk, and everyone on board had died. And remember, after he said this, Florence had tried to get 4-year-old Joe to explain, but he wouldn't. And he never played the game again. So now, in hindsight, Florence believed that her 4-year-old brother, all those years ago, had somehow predicted his own death. On the evening of the 19th of April, 1989, a 62-year-old man named Thomas Meehan was sitting in his living room in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was relaxing, watching some television, when his phone rang. Thomas picked it up and said hello. He heard the voice of his daughter Patricia on the other end of the line. And right away he could tell from the tone of her voice that she was feeling really down. This didn't really surprise him. Patricia was 37 years old, and Thomas knew she had been struggling a lot lately. She lived almost 2,000 miles away from him in Bozeman, Montana, where she worked as a ranch hand. She liked her job, for the most part, mainly because she absolutely loved animals. but she had a really hard time getting along with people. She was lonely. She didn't have a lot of close friends. On top of that, she had recently been through a tough breakup. And even though she had always wanted kids, she had never had any of her own. To her father, it seemed like his daughter was going through a classic midlife crisis. So, as Thomas was on the phone, listening to his daughter make small talk about her life, he decided to cut through it. He just asked her, "Hey, what's going on? How are you really doing?" Patricia paused for a moment. Then, she vaguely said that she was just under a lot of stress. She told him she was thinking about quitting her job and moving away from Bozeman. She then asked her dad if he would be okay with her coming to Pittsburgh, maybe moving back in with him for a while. Thomas adored his daughter, and he felt for everything she was going through. So, without a moment's hesitation, he told her, of course. Of course she could come home anytime she wanted. Hearing this definitely seemed to lighten Patricia's mood. She told her dad that she would call him back the next day to make more solid plans. And then she said she loved him, and she hung up the phone. But the next day, Thomas did not get a call from Patricia. In fact, he never got another call from his daughter ever again. The following day, April 20th, at about 8:15 inches the evening, something strange happened 1,500 miles away from Thomas's house in Pittsburgh. A woman named Carol Heights was driving down a very isolated two-lane highway in the rural town of Circle, Montana. It was dark and cold outside. The only thing Carol could see was the red taillights of the one car driving in front of her. Beyond that, on either side of the highway, there was just big, empty fields stretching out into the darkness. But then, out of nowhere, the car in front of her, which had been driving along at a steady speed, suddenly swerved off the road. For a second, Carol was just confused. Why would they do that? What caused that car to suddenly veer out of the way? But then, a split second later, Carol understood exactly what had happened. Because right in front of her, in her lane, was another car driving the wrong way, barreling straight towards her. Carol jammed on her brakes and tried to swerve out of the way, just like the car in front of her had done. But she wasn't fast enough. The other car smashed into her, basically head-on. Carol felt her head snap back against the seat. There was a deafening, metallic crunching sound, and then everything went black. Just a couple of minutes later, Carol opened her eyes. She realized she had survived the crash. She felt a sharp pain in her neck, and her car was a complete mess. The airbags had deployed. It was obvious she'd been in a very serious wreck, but she was alive. Eventually, Carol managed to push her door open and climb out of the car. Her first thought was to check on the other driver. The other car was smashed right up against hers, and she couldn't see if the person inside was okay. So she got out and started walking over to the other vehicle. But before she could reach it, the driver of the other car also climbed out. In the combined glare of both cars' headlights, Carol could see that the other person was a middle-aged woman. She appeared to have shoulder-length strawberry blonde hair. And this woman, she didn't seem to be hurt, at least not visibly. In fact, what was really weird was that she seemed very, very calm. This woman just stood there by her wrecked car, not saying a single word to Carol. She didn't acknowledge what she had just done, which was drive the wrong way down a highway and smash head-on into Carol's car, nearly killing her. There was no recognition of that at all. Instead, she just stood there. And then, eventually, she turned and just stared directly at Carol. This was starting to get very alarming for Carol. It caused her to stop in her tracks and just stand there as well, staring back at this woman, not really sure what to do or say. And as Carol was waiting to see what would happen next, the other driver, this middle-aged woman, simply turned and started walking away. At this point, Carol yelled out to her to stop. She shouted that she couldn't go, that they had just been in a horrible accident, and they had to wait for the police to get there. She couldn't just leave the scene. But the woman didn't even look back. She just calmly walked off the highway, climbed over a wire fence into one of those big empty fields on the side of the road, and just kept on walking until Carol couldn't see her anymore. She had just vanished into the darkness. When the police arrived about 45 minutes later at 9 p.m., they found the two wrecked cars and a very shaken Carol. The other driver, as Carol explained, was gone. So, the police ran the license plate of the car that had hit Carol's. They learned that it was registered to a 37-year-old woman named Patricia Meehan. But beyond the fact that Patricia had apparently just walked away from the crash, the other weird thing was that the registration showed she lived 400 miles away. The police had no idea what she was even doing all the way out here in Circle, Montana. Patricia did not come back to the crash site. So eventually, the police called in K9 units and they began searching for her. The dogs were able to pick up her trail. They found a line of her footprints leading out into that dark field. They followed that trail for hours and hours, deep into the empty landscape. But eventually, the footprints just stopped, and the dogs lost her scent. The police would continue looking for her, but they never found another trace of Patricia. It really was like she had just wandered into that field and vanished into thin air. But that was not the end of the story. About 2 weeks later, a totally unrelated police officer was eating at a fast food restaurant in Luverne, Minnesota. This was about 700 miles away from the crash site. Now, even though this officer lived and worked in a completely different state, he had actually heard about Patricia Meehan's disappearance. He'd seen pictures of her, because by this point, her case had become national news. So, when this officer looked across the restaurant he was in and saw a middle-aged woman with strawberry blonde hair sitting in a booth all by herself, silently drinking a glass of water and just staring off into space, he immediately thought it was Patricia. The police officer had no idea if this really was her. He was pretty confident it was, but it just seemed so random and so bizarre that she would be here, of all places. He also didn't know if she was alone or what she was doing. So, instead of getting up and talking to her, he decided to just stay in his seat and keep an eye on her. And for the next 5 hours, the woman he believed was Patricia just sat there in the booth. She slowly drank water and stared off into space for 5 straight hours. Eventually, the restaurant closed for the night. An employee had to go over and tell the woman that she had to leave. They also told the officer that he too had to go. So after the officer and the woman he thought was Patricia had left the restaurant, the officer kind of hung back and continued to watch her. And she just walked right across the street and went into a diner that was open all night. This time, the officer did not keep his distance. He went inside the diner, walked right over to where she was sitting at a table, and he sat down next to her. He just said, "What's your name?" For a moment, the woman seemed kind of confused, like she couldn't understand why a random police officer was sitting with her. But instead of challenging him, she just went quiet for a second. And then, in a sort of hushed voice, she said that she was from Colorado. But then a moment later, she shook her head and said, "Actually, no. I'm from Israel." And before she could give up any more information, like her name or why she was there, she suddenly jumped up out of her seat and ran outside. The police officer was caught off guard. He was a little slow to get up and chase after her. He ran outside too, but by the time he got out there, she had disappeared again. Over the next month or so, the police in charge of Patricia's case received dozens of reports just like this one. They came from people who believed they had seen Patricia at restaurants and truck stops all over America. And the police actually confirmed many of these sightings. They believed that these witnesses really did see Patricia, that it wasn't just some look-alike. And in every single case, the witnesses reported the same thing. This woman, presumably Patricia, refused to speak and was just staring vacantly into space. She didn't seem to know who she was or what she was even doing. But also, in every one of these cases, before anybody could intervene or ask her questions or just try to help her in some way, Patricia would run off and disappear again. It was like Patricia was a ghost, appearing and disappearing over and over again all across the country. As of today, there have been over 5,000 reported sightings of Patricia Meehan. But still, we do not know where she is. Her case, to this day, is still open and unsolved. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the morning of Saturday, the 18th of November, 1961, a 23-year-old man named Michael Rockefeller grabbed the starter cord on his boat's small outboard motor and yanked it hard. The engine sputtered once and died. He tried again. Nothing. With every failed attempt, Michael and his small crew drifted farther away from the coast of New Guinea and deeper into the waters of the Arafura Sea. And the dead engine wasn't even their biggest problem. Their boat, a 40-foot catamaran built from two massive handcrafted canoes tied together, was rapidly taking on water. It was sinking. Just minutes earlier, everything had been going according to plan. Michael and his companions had been traveling along the dense, jungle-covered coastline of New Guinea on their way to visit the Asmat tribe. But to reach them, they had to cross a dangerous stretch of water where a muddy river emptied into the sea. The collision of the river current and the ocean created violent, unpredictable waves. As their boat entered the rough water, wave after wave crashed over the sides, flooding the deck and killing the engine. Now, stranded miles from shore in a sinking boat, Michael Rockefeller was about to disappear into one of the most disturbing mysteries of the 20th century. What had brought him to this remote corner of the world was an obsession with the artwork created by the Asmat people, especially their sacred sculptures known as bispoles. He was completely obsessed with the artwork created by the Asmat people, especially their unique and sacred sculptures known as bispoles. These weren't just simple carvings. They were incredibly intricate works created by master carvers within the tribe. They would take a single massive piece of wood and painstakingly etch it away until it looked like a column of human figures, one standing on the shoulders of the next. The poles were beautiful and powerful to look at, but to the Asmat, they weren't made for display. They believed these poles contained the souls of warriors from their tribe who had been killed in combat. And until the tribe avenged the deaths of those warriors, essentially by killing their enemies in return, those souls would remain trapped within the wood. This meant the Asmat never sold them or got rid of them. These poles were a fundamental part of their culture and their spiritual world. Months before this trip, Michael had visited the Asmat tribe. He had learned all about the bispoles and what they represented. He believed he had successfully negotiated a deal to acquire one. He would trade his modern goods, things the tribe couldn't get, for one of their sacred poles. Michael had given them everything he promised, but the tribe had never sent the pole. So now he was on his way back. He was determined to claim the artifact he felt he had rightfully bartered for. But as he sat in his sinking boat, watching the shoreline of New Guinea become a distant green line, the bispole was the last thing on his mind. He just needed to figure out how to survive. There were 3 other people on the boat with him. There was a French anthropologist named René and 2 teenage guides who were actually from the Asmat region themselves. Their names were Simon and Leo. After Michael failed to get the engine running, René tried, then Simon, then Leo. They all yanked on the pull cord until their arms were sore, but the motor was dead. Finally, Simon and Leo, who knew these waters better than anyone, spoke up. They told Michael and René that their only option was to abandon the catamaran. They needed to jump into the water and swim for shore. At that moment, the coast was about half a mile away, which was a long swim but doable. The problem was they were drifting so fast that if they waited much longer, the distance would become impossible. René, however, was not a strong swimmer. And Michael, for his part, wasn't ready to give up on the expedition just yet. The catamaran was loaded with all the goods he had brought for bartering. He had bundles of tobacco, spools of fishing line, clothes, candy, and steel tools. He knew the tribe didn't have these things, and he saw them as his leverage, not just for the bispole, but for other unique pieces of art they might have. Even though he knew the boat and everything on it was going to sink eventually, he just couldn't bring himself to abandon it all right then and there. So, a new plan was formed. The two teenage guides, Simon and Leo, would make the swim alone. They would go for help, while Michael and Renee stayed with the sinking vessel. A few moments later, the two young men slipped over the side and began their long, arduous swim towards the shore. As Michael watched them go, it must have dawned on him just how far he was from his own world. It had been months since he had a proper shower. He was caked in dirt and salt, his skin was sunburned, and his hands were rough and calloused from paddling. This was not the life he was born into. Because Michael wasn't from New Guinea. He was from America, and his family was one of the wealthiest, most powerful families in the history of the world. He was a Rockefeller. His grandfather was John D. Rockefeller, the oil tycoon who was, at the time, literally the richest man on the planet. And his father, Nelson Rockefeller, was the governor of New York and would later become the vice president of the United States. But Michael wasn't interested in a life of politics or business. He had found his true calling in the remote jungles of New Guinea. He had first come to the island 7 months earlier as part of a film crew from Harvard University. They were there to document a remote tribe, and Michael simply fell in love with the raw adventure of it all. During that trip, while filming a battle between two tribes, he had even been accidentally shot in the shoulder with an arrow. But instead of being scared off, the experience only deepened his connection to the place. In fact, he never even told his powerful family about being wounded. He was worried that if they found out, the Rockefellers might seek some kind of retribution against the tribe that had inadvertently hurt him. Michael was incredibly respectful and protective of the people he met in New Guinea. In many ways, he felt more at home with them than he did with his own family. So after the Harvard film crew finished their documentary and went back to America, Michael stayed behind. Around that same time, his father, Nelson, had opened a new museum in New York City called the Museum of Primitive Art. It displayed artwork from places exactly like New Guinea. Now, this was the early 1960s, and many Westerners viewed the indigenous people of New Guinea as primitive or savage. So, a lot of people went to the museum out of a kind of morbid curiosity to see what these backwards people were creating. But Michael had a much deeper understanding. He felt it was his personal mission to find the most incredible art New Guinea had to offer, like the Asmat bisque poles, and send it back to his father's museum. He didn't want it to be a spectacle. He wanted people in the West to see the beauty and complexity of this art and to respect the people who made it, just like he did. So he had teamed up with Renee, the French anthropologist, to travel all around the island searching for these masterpieces. A few hours after Simon and Leo had jumped into the sea, Michael and Renee had no way of knowing if the boys had even made it. No rescue boats had appeared on the horizon. For all they knew, they were completely on their own. And their catamaran was sinking lower and lower. At one point, they started grabbing buckets and desperately bailing water out, but it was a useless effort. The water was coming in way too fast. Then a large rogue wave slammed into them, and the entire catamaran flipped over, throwing Michael and Renee into the rough sea. Luckily, they were both able to surface and swim over to the overturned boat. There was an air pocket trapped underneath the hulls, which was keeping it afloat. So they just held on, with Michael also using an empty gas canister he had tied to his belt as an extra flotation device. They just floated there, holding on to the wreckage, hoping that Simon and Leo had made it and that help was on the way. But in the back of his mind, Michael knew that if help didn't come soon, he would have to do something drastic. He would have to attempt that swim to shore himself, a shore that was now much, much farther than half a mile away. By the next morning, as the sun rose over the Arafura Sea, Michael and Renee were still in the water, still clinging to the boat. No help had come. Michael was an excellent swimmer, but by now he estimated they were at least 5, maybe even 10 miles from the coast. It would be a monumental swim in very dangerous, choppy water. But Michael was a Rockefeller. He was confident, and he had an unshakable belief in his own abilities. He started telling Renee that he was going to do it. He told him, "I can make it. I know I can swim the whole distance, even if it's 10 miles. You just hang tight. It'll take a while, but I'll get us help." Renee pleaded with him not to go. It seemed like suicide. But Michael was determined. He said he had to do something, otherwise they were both going to die out there. And so, all Renee could do was watch as Michael stripped off some of his clothes to reduce drag, attached a second gas canister to his belt for more buoyancy, and then, after shaking Renee's hand, he turned towards the distant shore. At around 8 a.m. on Sunday, the 19th of November, 1961, Michael Rockefeller started to swim. About 12 hours later, that night, Renee was still alone, holding on to the catamaran, exhausted and losing hope. Suddenly, the sky above him erupted in a brilliant flash of light. A plane was flying overhead. They had spotted him and had fired a flare to let him know that help was on its way. Just a couple of hours after that, a boat appeared and pulled Renee from the water. As he climbed aboard, weak but overwhelmingly relieved, he asked the captain if Michael had sent them. He asked if Michael Rockefeller had made it to shore and told them where he was. The captain looked at him and said no. He told Renee they had been alerted by two teenage guides, Simon and Leo, who had made it to shore hours earlier. No one had seen or heard from Michael at all. As soon as that news was relayed, it was like an explosion went off within the Rockefeller family. They mobilized everything. All of their money, all of their resources, all of their political influence was brought to bear on one single goal: finding Michael. They launched what was probably the largest and most expensive manhunt in history up to that point. They dispatched private ships, helicopters, and planes. They got the U.S. Navy involved with their own fleet of vessels. They scoured every inch of the coastline and the open sea for weeks. But they found absolutely nothing. No sign of Michael anywhere. The search would unofficially continue for years. It was never as intense as it was in those first few weeks, but there was always someone, some entity funded by the Rockefellers looking for Michael in that area. But by 1964, 3 years after he had started that swim, the family finally had to accept the inevitable. They concluded that Michael must have drowned. He had likely succumbed to exhaustion or the currents during that impossibly long swim to shore. And that became the official story. In America, that's what everyone believed happened to Michael Rockefeller. His sister even wrote a best-selling book about the family's grief and the process of accepting his loss. But in New Guinea, a very different story began to spread. Rumors about Michael's true fate were whispered along jungle trade routes. They were shared between visiting missionaries and gossiped about in the pages of sensational tabloids and adventure magazines. In 1969, 5 years after Michael was officially declared dead, an adventure magazine reporter named Milt Macklin heard a wild story from a mysterious Australian source. This source claimed that he had actually seen Michael Rockefeller alive, living deep in the New Guinea jungle, not far from where his boat had gone down. Despite how unbelievable it sounded, Milt Macklin decided to follow up on the tip. He put together a film crew and flew to New Guinea. He went to the exact area where the source claimed to have seen Michael, and he launched his own investigation. He spoke to locals, he trekked through the jungle, he scoured the region, but he found no sign of Michael. Milt, feeling defeated, eventually returned home. He ended up writing his own best-selling book about his failed quest to find the lost Rockefeller heir. But here's the crucial detail. Even though he had shot hours and hours of film footage of the tribes in that area, both from a distance and up close, he and his team never really went back and reviewed it. They shot it, didn't find Michael, and just put all the film cans into storage. 40 years later, another documentary film crew decided they were going to make a film about the enduring mystery of Michael Rockefeller. The rumors that he was still alive and living in the jungle had never completely died out. Before this new crew went to New Guinea themselves, they did their research and they managed to uncover all of that old, unwatched footage from Milt Macklin's 1969 expedition. They sat down and began to watch all of it hour after hour. And that's when they found something that no one could believe. Buried in all that footage was a single brief shot. It was filmed from a distance with the camera on land looking out towards the water. A long war canoe filled with Asmat warriors paddles into the frame. It's clearly a war party on their way to a battle or a raid. But as the camera holds on the canoe, you can see that among the dark-skinned, powerfully built Asmat men, there is one person who stands out completely. He is a naked, bearded white man. And even though the film quality was poor and the shot was from far away, he looked, for all the world, like an older Michael Rockefeller. As soon as this footage was made public, the story went viral. The old rumors exploded into a full-blown global theory. The heir to one of the world's greatest fortunes hadn't died at all. He had survived his swim, been accepted by the Asmat, and had chosen to turn his back on his family and his old life to live as one of them in the jungle. Now, of course, there was no way to prove it was really him. It could have been a missionary, or a trader, or some other white person who happened to be in that remote part of the world. But the story was just too incredible, and it spread everywhere. In 2012, more than 50 years after Michael Rockefeller disappeared, a National Geographic journalist named Carl Hoffman decided he was going to be the one to finally get to the bottom of the mystery. He had been fascinated by the story since he was a kid. He and an interpreter traveled to New Guinea, to the very region where Michael had been last seen. They didn't just visit. They lived with the Asmat people for months. They learned their customs, they earned their trust, and eventually they earned their respect. And after months of this, the village elders began to tell Carl a new story. It was a story he had never heard before, the real story of what had happened to Michael. But they gave him a very serious warning. They told him that if he ever repeated what they were about to tell him, the entire village would likely be killed in retaliation, and maybe he would be killed too. But Carl didn't listen. After he heard the truth, he left New Guinea and wrote a book about it called Savage Harvest. And according to that book, this is what really happened to Michael Rockefeller. On the morning of the 19th of November, 1961, about 24 hours after Michael had jumped into the sea and started his long swim, a group of about 50 Asmat warriors were resting. They were in 8 long canoes, gathered at the mouth of the same river that had caused Michael's boat to capsize. 3 of the tribe's elders, men named Finn, Ajim, and Pep, were among them. They weren't really going anywhere. They were just relaxing after a long journey, some smoking loosely wrapped cigars, others chewing on a starchy flower made from a palm plant. They were all naked, except for a few decorative bands on their arms and legs. Some had intricate bone piercings through their noses and ears. It was a peaceful scene. Then, suddenly, Ajim, one of the elders, spotted something out in the water. It was a white object moving slowly from the open sea into the mouth of their river. It was slithering through the water. Ajim immediately called out to the others. He shouted that there was something coming, maybe a white crocodile or a sea serpent. They all turned to look. Slowly, this strange white thing was getting closer and closer. Not wanting to be caught by surprise, the entire group of warriors readied their weapons and began paddling their 8 canoes out to intercept whatever it was. If it was a threat, they would deal with it. As the canoes converged on the object, some of the men had their spears raised, ready to strike. But when they finally got close enough to see it clearly, they realized it wasn't a monster. It was a man. A white man. He was floating on his back, exhausted, with two strange containers tied to his belt. He was clearly not a threat. At once, the warriors lowered their spears. Some of them even laughed, relieved that there was no danger. The white man, Michael Rockefeller, rolled over in the water and looked up. He couldn't believe his eyes. After swimming for nearly a day, he had been found by the very people he had been trying to reach. He thought they were there to rescue him. Almost crying with relief, he swam the last few feet and grabbed onto the side of one of the canoes. As he held on, one of the elders, a man named Pep, looked down at Michael. Then Pep looked up at the other two elders, Finn and Eugene. They just stared at each other for a long moment. They looked back down at Michael, then back at each other, and then all three of them gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was an agreement. Pep then reached down and helped a completely exhausted Michael into the canoe. Michael immediately collapsed in the bottom of the boat, just overcome with relief and fatigue. He just lay there as the Asmat warriors turned their canoes around and began paddling back up the river inland. As they paddled, all 50 of them in all 8 canoes began a strange rhythmic chant. It was a powerful, unified sound that echoed across the water. Michael, who had studied Asmat culture, had never heard this particular chant before. He was mesmerized by it. He tried to ask the men in his canoe what it meant, but they completely ignored him. They just kept paddling and chanting, so Michael just lay back, listening, letting them carry him to what he believed was safety. Then, all at once, the chanting stopped. The canoes turned and pulled into a small, muddy inlet that led to a clearing on the riverbank. Michael noticed they were slowing down, so he propped himself up and looked over the side of the canoe, expecting to see their village. But there was no village. It was just an empty clearing. Right away, Michael started to feel a sense of urgency. He thought, I need to get to their village so I can find someone to contact the authorities. They need to go rescue Renee. They need to find Simon and Leo. He started trying to ask the men in his canoe for help, but the language barrier was immense. Neither side could understand the other. Then one of the Asmat men just started laughing at Michael. When he did, the rest of the warriors looked over, saw what was happening, and they all began to laugh too. A chorus of laughter directed at him. Michael had no idea what was going on. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the laughing stopped. In an instant, they were all back to that strange, rhythmic chanting. The warriors began to climb out of their canoes and wade onto the shore. Michael started to sense that something was very, very wrong. Instead of getting out of the canoe with them, he instinctively lay back down, almost as if he was trying to hide. As he did this, the same tribesmen who had first laughed at him stood over him, still chanting. He smiled down at Michael. And then he raised his spear and drove it directly into Michael's side. The second the spear went in, other members of the tribe raised large ceremonial horns and began to blow them, a loud, bleeding sound. Michael screamed in pain, but he was too weak to fight back. He rolled over to his other side, trying to protect himself, and the man just smiled, lifted his bloody spear, and drove it into Michael's other side. After pulling the spear out, Michael, now in horrible pain but running on pure adrenaline, managed to pull himself up and over the side of the canoe. He fell out into the mud and tried to stand up, tried to get away, but he had nowhere to go. As he fumbled in the mud, 2 of the tribesmen walked up behind him, grabbed him under his arms, and began to drag him. They carried him across the clearing and into the jungle. And as they walked, the rhythmic chanting and the periodic blasting of the horns continued. They dragged Michael through the jungle until they reached another, more hidden clearing nowhere near their village. They took him to the center of it and forced him onto his knees. Michael was hunched over, clutching his bleeding sides, surrounded by a circle of chanting warriors. Then, one of the tribesmen walked up to Michael, grabbed his head by the hair, and pushed it forward, exposing the back of his neck. Another warrior stepped into the circle. The chanting grew louder. The horns blew again. This second man raised a stone axe high over his head and brought it down with full force onto the back of Michael Rockefeller's neck. It turns out the Asmat tribe knew exactly who Michael was. They remembered him from his visit months earlier when he had tried to trade for their bispoles, and they had been deeply offended. They couldn't believe that this rich, white outsider had shown up and thought he could just buy one of their most sacred objects, an object containing the souls of their ancestors, as if it were just some trinket to be put on a sleeve in a faraway museum. They held on to a deep resentment for him. That was why they never sent the pole. They were never going to give it to him. So, when Michael had, by some strange twist of fate, floated right into their river, the three village elders, Finn, Ajim, and Pep, saw it as a sign. That look they exchanged, that nod, was an agreement. They were going to ritualistically kill Michael. His death would be the vengeance they needed to release the souls of their fallen warriors trapped in the bispoles, especially the souls of those who had been killed by white men in the past. Michael was going to pay for the crimes of others. That chant Michael had heard was the chant they performed during their execution ritual. And they didn't just kill him. After the axe came down on his neck, another tribesman stepped forward with a knife. He grabbed Michael's hair, pulled his head back, and severed it from his body. Then, as the chanting and horns continued, other members of the tribe moved in and began to systematically dismember Michael's body. They cut him to pieces, separating his organs, his flesh, and his bones into different piles. They quickly got a fire going. And then they cooked and ate him. Of all the parts of his body, his brain was considered the most powerful prize. Only the three elders, Finn, Ajim, and Pep, were allowed to eat it. After they had finished the feast, they wrapped up the remaining meat in leaves to take back to the village and eat later. Finn, one of the elders, took Michael's skull. He would bring it back, cover it in banana leaves, paint it, and keep it as a trophy. A few days later, when that massive Rockefeller-funded search party descended on the area, the Asmat tribe knew they could never say a single word about what really happened. If the story got out, they were certain that Westerners would come and exact a terrible revenge on their entire village. And so, for decades, their secret was safe. It was only passed down through oral tradition until the journalist Carl Hoffman finally heard it and published it in his book. But despite the book and its detailed, horrific account, there were always questions about its credibility. The story of Michael Rockefeller was already so full of mystery and strange theories. And so, to this day, the Rockefeller family and official authorities have never acknowledged this version of events. The official story remains unchanged. Michael Rockefeller drowned while swimming to shore to get help. That's it. Thank you so much for watching. To this day, no one knows for certain what happened to Michael Rockefeller out there on the coast of New Guinea. Maybe he drowned during that impossible swim to shore. Or maybe the story whispered among the Asmat people for decades was true all along. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to check out our other true crime and mystery stories. And if you have your own theory about what really happened to Michael Rockefeller, let me know down in the comments. Until next time. On paper, Austin Haroof had the kind of childhood most people would envy. He was born on the 21st of December, 1996, to a dentist, father, and a pharmacist mother, and grew up in Palm Beach County, Florida, one of the wealthiest areas in the entire country. It was the kind of place filled with luxury homes, sunshine, and opportunity. By 2021, more than 40 billionaires lived in the county, and for most of Austin's early life, everything seemed stable, comfortable, and normal. But in 2010, when Austin was 13 years old, that stability suddenly cracked. His parents announced they were getting a divorce. For Austin and his younger sister, Haley, who was only a year younger than him, the news was a massive shock. And what made it even more overwhelming was how quickly everything changed afterward. Within that same year, both of their parents had already started new relationships. Suddenly, the life Austin had always known felt completely different almost overnight. Now, of course, this was a huge shock to Austin and to his younger sister Haley, who was only a year younger than him. But, by all accounts, they both adjusted to their new normal relatively quickly. A big part of that was because the kids didn't have to move out. They got to stay in the familiar family home with their mom, which provided a sense of stability. Their father did move out, but he made sure to get a home that was very close by, so he was never far away. The family dynamic had changed, but the core pieces were still there. About a year after the divorce, Austin began high school, and he didn't just attend, he absolutely excelled. From day one, he was placed into all advanced classes, and even within these challenging courses filled with the brightest students, Austin was consistently at the top of his class. He was smart, dedicated, and driven. Austin was also a big athletic guy. He stood at about 6 feet tall and weighed a solid 200 pounds. So, naturally, he gravitated towards sports. He played football for all 4 years, he was in high school, a significant commitment. And for 1 year, his sophomore year, he also took up wrestling. But despite his size and his willingness to play these very rough, very physical sports, Austin was not an aggressive person by nature. In fact, his football coaches actually used to criticize him for not being aggressive enough. On game days, they would try to get him worked up, try to make him mad, hoping that it would inspire him to go out on the field and just smash some people. But it never really worked. Because Austin was just Austin. He was a laid-back, easygoing guy who was actually much more interested in helping people than he was in hurting them. Towards the end of his high school years, this desire to help people became a central focus for him. He became almost obsessed with trying to identify a career path that would allow him to help the most people possible. And he was so genuinely passionate about this that whenever he spoke about it, a huge involuntary smile would just appear on his face. It was impossible to miss his enthusiasm. Because of this, and because of Austin's generally happy and positive disposition, his father very lovingly started referring to him as the happy boy. Shortly before Austin's high school graduation in 2015, a letter arrived in the mail that would set the course for his future. It was from Florida State University, and it was a letter of acceptance, informing him that he had been admitted into their prestigious 4-year pre-med program. Austin had settled on medicine as being the ultimate way he could fulfill his dream of helping people. So, being accepted into this very competitive program was like a best-case scenario come to life. The news sent waves of excitement through the family. Austin and his parents, his sister, they were all absolutely elated. That summer that followed his high school graduation was totally charmed. Austin was on cloud 9, living out the final carefree days before heading off to college. He spent a lot of time with his family, soaking up the moments with his parents and his sister. He hung out with his friends, making memories they would all look back on. Then, finally, at the end of the summer, the day came. His family packed all of his belongings into the car, and they all drove 6 hours north to Tallahassee, where the Florida State campus was located. They helped him move into his new dorm room, setting up his new life. And afterwards, they gave him a big hug, wished him good luck, and they left. I'm sure on that long ride back home, his family members thought to themselves that Austin was doing so great. He wasn't just ready for college, he was ready to be an adult. He was ready to live on his own, to be responsible, to chase his dreams. And at the end of Austin's first year in college, that belief seemed to be entirely accurate. On the surface, he was thriving. Austin got excellent grades in his demanding pre-med courses. He met a nice girlfriend. And even though he wasn't playing organized sports like football anymore, he had found another athletic outlet in bodybuilding. He became passionate about fitness and even built a decent-sized social media presence around his bodybuilding journey. From the outside, he was the picture of success. But underneath all of this public success that Austin was having that year, he was actually struggling a lot of the time He just wasn't telling anyone. He kept a journal, and in its private pages, he documented a deep and persistent sense of inadequacy. This feeling was caused primarily by his perception that his peers didn't accept him, that he didn't fit in. And so he would write endlessly about how if he could just stop being so shy, if he could just be more assertive and more outgoing, then more people would embrace him. They would like him. They would finally accept him. Over the course of that year, Austin also started to self-medicate, abusing different substances to cope with his inner turmoil. These included things like alcohol and marijuana, but also Vyvanse. Vyvanse is a powerful stimulant drug typically used to treat people with attention deficit disorder, and he was using it without a prescription. He also began experimenting with hallucinogenic drugs like acid and mushrooms, and he tried MDMA, which is a kind of cross between a stimulant and a hallucinogen, and those are just the drugs that we are aware he was taking. It's entirely possible, even likely, that he was taking other drugs too. So, Austin began to oscillate between these two extremes. He would be on the high of whatever drug or combination of drugs he was on, and then he would crash down to the low of his sober mind, which was a mind totally saturated with anxious and depressive thoughts. Before the end of that first school year, Austin was secretly poised for a full-blown mental breakdown. And it seemed like on some level he knew it was coming, too. In the last month before the end of school, his internet search history paints a terrifying picture of his state of mind. It was filled with desperate questions. Questions like, I think I'm crazy, what do I do, and how do you know if you're crazy? He searched for how to deal with obsessive thoughts. And then there were searches that suggested a complete disconnect from reality. Do I need to sleep? And what happens if you don't sleep? It was clear from these searches that he was starting to seriously question his own sanity. He was lost and scared. When Austin finally returned back home from Florida State for the summer, his family immediately noticed there was something deeply wrong with him. This was not the same happy boy who had left for college less than a year ago. Within just a few days of being home, Austin had moved his bed from his comfortable bedroom down into the family garage. When his family asked him why, he gave them a chilling explanation. He said the house was full of demons. At night, instead of sleeping, Austin would patrol the house. He would literally just walk all around the house all night long, never stopping. And every 2 hours, like clockwork, he would knock on the bedroom doors of his family members. He would knock and then loudly announce that he was guarding them from the demons in the house. Now, you can imagine how his family felt at the time. This behavior was so unbelievably weird, so totally out of character for the Austin they knew, that they just didn't really know what to do. Even though it was obvious that something was terribly wrong, they didn't immediately jump into action. At first, the only thing they did was to just start locking their bedroom doors at night to prevent Austin from coming inside during his strange nighttime patrols. But as the summer progressed, Austin's behavior didn't get any better. He continued to act totally bizarre, totally weird, with no rational explanation. His family became more and more convinced that he must be on drugs. To them, that was the only thing that could possibly explain this complete and total personality shift. So, when they confronted him about his drug use, he would admit it. He told them he was taking drugs, lots of different drugs, psychedelics, stimulants, you name it. And so naturally, his family latched onto his drug use as being the root cause of all his strange behavior. They focused their efforts almost exclusively on that one issue, on trying to get Austin clean again, believing that if they could just stop the drugs, their old son, the happy boy, would return. But towards the end of the summer, something shifted. Austin insisted that he wasn't taking any drugs anymore. But even with that claim, he was still acting totally crazy, totally unhinged. So, around mid-August, the family decided they had to do something more drastic. They decided they had to utilize something in Florida called the Baker Act. Under the Baker Act, individuals who are suspected of having a severe mental illness can be detained for up to 72 hours at the request of their loved one. And during these 72 hours, this individual is thoroughly assessed by medical professionals to see what's going on with them. Then, at the end of those 72 hours, they're given a treatment plan that their family is supposed to help them enact. It was a serious step, but they felt they had no other choice. But before the family could put this plan into motion, something horrific happened. On the morning of August 15th, one of Austin's very close friends, someone he had known since the second grade, got an unexpected visit. Austin just showed up at his house without calling ahead or letting him know, which was very uncharacteristic. The friend opened the door, and Austin just stood there and asked him a single bizarre question. "What year was I born?" The friend, confused, answered, 1996. As soon as Austin heard the answer, he didn't give any reaction to it. He just turned around, walked away, and left. So, this longtime friend is standing in his doorway, watching Austin walk away, wondering what on earth is going on with this guy. Is he high on drugs? Is he drunk? What was that all about? The friend goes back inside his house, and he's thinking to himself, what should I do? After a couple of minutes, he decides he has to call Austin just to make sure he's okay. So he calls him, and Austin picks up. It's unclear exactly what they talked about on the phone, but the friend managed to convince Austin to come back to his house and just spend the day with him. In reality, the friend just wanted to keep an eye on him to make sure Austin was okay. So Austin comes back to the friend's house. Then the two of them would actually leave the house and meet up with some of their other friends who were also in town for the summer. They also met up with Austin's sister, Haley. The group decided they were going to go to the beach for the day. But on their walk to the beach, Austin tells the group that he just needs to get something from his house and that he'll meet them down at the water. At this point, the group believes Austin is more or less fine, maybe just a little off. So they say, okay, yep, we'll meet you down there. So Austin breaks off from the group and goes to his house. When he comes back to the beach and meets up with his friends again, he has completely changed his outfit. He was now wearing this very thick, large football jersey. He was wearing long sweatpants that were also very thick. He had on 2 wristwatches, one on each wrist. And he had on sunglasses. As he walks down onto the beach, his friends look up at him. It's super hot out, and they're at the beach in Florida in August. This is a totally weird and inappropriate outfit to have on, and immediately they start kind of giving him a hard time about it, teasing him about his strange outfit choice. But Austin did not think it was funny at all. At first, he was just quiet. But then he kind of lashed out at them and said, "If you tell me I'm crazy, I will kill you." At this, his friends immediately stopped teasing him. Everyone just said, "Okay, man. Hey, didn't mean anything by it. Just giving you a hard time. No big deal." But Austin was clearly worked up, very agitated. So his sister comes over to him and she's trying to calm him down, telling him, "Hey, calm down. It's okay. It's not a big deal." And during this conversation, Austin suddenly seems to go back to being somewhat normal again. He turns to his sister and he says, completely seriously, "I'm actually half horse and I'm immortal." His sister is just stunned. She looks at him and says, "What? You really need to get professional help. You need to see a therapist or a psychologist or something. Something is wrong with you, and it's been wrong all summer. You need to get help." Now, apparently, Austin actually responded to this very positively. He looked at her and said, "I agree. There is something going on, and I do need to get help." You're right. So after that strange exchange, Austin and the rest of the group, they stayed at the beach for several more hours. Then, in the evening time, Austin, his sister, and that same very close friend, the guy who saw Austin in the morning, when he asked what year he was born, they all said they had to leave. The trio leaves the beach and they head to Duffy's, which was a local restaurant in town. They were going there to meet up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend for dinner. So as they're getting to this restaurant, they're walking along the sidewalk, getting closer and closer, when suddenly Austin turns to his sister and says, "Hey, I need to test out my immortality." And then he just turns away from her, away from the sidewalk, and starts walking directly into traffic. He was just going to let a car hit him to test if he was truly immortal. His sister, with incredible reflexes, immediately was able to grab him. She pulled him back onto the sidewalk and then basically stood on his left side, physically preventing him from running out into the traffic again. She kind of pushed him along up the sidewalk right up to the front door of the restaurant. And when they got there, Austin had stopped trying to walk into traffic. He was acting normal again. It was there at the entrance that the trio met up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend. The five of them then went inside Duffy's restaurant. It was about 7:45 p.m. when they got inside. They were very quickly sat at a table in the very back of the restaurant in a booth, and there happened to be a CCTV camera that was watching them while they were inside the building. So they're all sitting at this booth, and about 3 minutes after having sat down, Austin gets up. He walks away from the booth and walks as if he's going towards the bathroom. But then he stops. He doesn't go to the bathroom. He turns around and walks back towards the front of the building, and then he walks right out the front doors. He just leaves the restaurant altogether. Now, it's unclear if the rest of his family at the table saw him do this. It doesn't seem like they did. But just a minute later, Austin comes back inside the restaurant and just walks right back to his table and sits down like absolutely nothing had ever happened. Less than 10 minutes later, Austin would get up again from his table. Except this time, instead of pretending to go to the bathroom, he just walks straight from his table right out the front doors of the restaurant and disappears. A couple of minutes later, Austin's mother, who was not at dinner with them, she was at her home, which happened to be nearby this restaurant. She was home when she heard the sound of someone coming into her house. So she went around to see who it was, and she found her son, Austin, in her kitchen. He was drinking vegetable oil straight from the bottle. And there was Parmesan cheese all over the counter that apparently he had been eating as well. So she runs up to him and she grabs the bottle of vegetable oil and puts it down. She tells him to stop. At which point, Austin does stop. Then, I guess Austin just went up to his room and he changed out of his clothes, perhaps because he got oil all over his shirt. And then his mom just drove him back to the restaurant. She watched him get out of the car and she watched him go through the front door, and then she drove off. So, about 30 minutes after he had left that second time, Austin walks back through the front doors of the restaurant. He's got a different shirt on, a different hat on, and he just walks to the back of the restaurant where his sister, his friend, and his father's girlfriend are, and he sits down, again, like nothing had ever happened. At first, it looks like everyone at the table is just silent. But then Austin's father very clearly said something to Austin, and it seems kind of hostile. It would turn out Austin's father, who loved his son dearly, was just totally at a loss for what to do with him. He was frustrated, scared, and confused. And he said to Austin when he sat back down, "What is wrong with you?" At this, Austin just stands up. He leans across the table and presses his father's face back up against his seat, kind of pinning him there. And then, at some point, he just lets go. He leaves the booth and he walks right out of the restaurant for a third and final time. Austin's friend, who was eating with them, he got up and kind of chased after Austin, but he was about 30 seconds behind him. So by the time he got outside, he didn't know where Austin went. He quickly came back into the restaurant and told the rest of the group he didn't know where Austin was. And so, at this point, Austin's father's girlfriend would actually call the police and report Austin missing. They knew he was totally unhinged, and they had no idea where he was going to go, if he was a threat to himself, or perhaps a threat to someone else. And so they figured they should just tell the police and have the police go find him. About 4 miles away from that restaurant, 3-year-old Michelle Mishkan was sitting in her garage watching TV. Normally, she would be joined by her husband, 59-year-old John Stevens, but he was out walking their dog. So, for the time being, Michelle was alone. The couple had been married for roughly 20 years. Between them, they had 3 children from previous marriages, and they were just totally and completely in love with each other. That garage was like their happy place. It was basically their living room. They loved having the big garage door wide open so they could wave to neighbors as they passed by and flag people down to come have a drink with them or just to chat for a while. They were known throughout the neighborhood as a very happy, loving couple that were just fun to be around. And according to their kids, they had both recently retired. John retired from his landscaping company that he owned, and Michelle retired from her job as a financial advisor. The two of them were apparently both just really excited about retirement life. They were excited to spend more time together and go out with their friends and go out fishing on their boat with their dog. And also to spend as much time as they could just lounging back in their garage. John and Michelle's neighbor, who lived directly across the street, was a middle-aged man named Jeff Fisher. Jeff was fairly close with the couple. He would usually watch their dogs for them anytime they went away on a trip, and he would often go over to their garage and have a drink and just kind of hang out with them. And so on this particular night, he was over in his house and he was planning on going to bed early. So he laid down in his bed, he's getting ready to go to sleep, when he hears some strange sounds coming from outside his window from across the street over near John and Michelle's property. So Jeff sits up in his bed and he kind of strains his ears to try to figure out what it was that he heard. And as he's trying to listen for some faint sound, he suddenly hears a blood-curdling scream, a woman's scream, coming from across the street. So Jeff instantly leapt into action. He jumped out of his bed, he ran downstairs, and he ran out his front door. And he looked across the street, and he saw this unknown man, some young man, that was slamming the car door of Michelle's car that was parked in her driveway. Then this man begins walking up the driveway. And at the top of the driveway, Jeff sees Michelle. She's standing in the garage, and she looks totally terrified. And she's facing this unknown young man. And of course, this unknown young man was Austin Harrouff. Now, Jeff had no idea what was actually going on. All he knew was that he heard this terrifying scream, which was probably Michelle, and he's looking out there and he's seeing a situation that just doesn't look right. It doesn't look good at all. And so instinctively, he decided he would just run across the street and make sure Michelle was okay. And if he had to, he would confront this unknown man, Austin. So Jeff begins running across his property, trying to get across the street to Michelle. But before he could even get all the way across the street, he's looking up and he can see this guy, Austin, has grabbed Michelle and thrown her on the ground. And now he's on top of her and he's beating her. So Jeff runs onto the driveway, and as he's going right up the driveway, between the two cars that were parked there, Austin leaps off of Michelle. He turns around and he looks directly at Jeff and he says, "You don't want a part of this." Now, Jeff, he's a pretty big guy himself. And so he's looking at Austin and he knows that if he doesn't do anything, this guy is just going to continue pummeling poor Michelle. And he had no idea where John was. So he ran up and kind of lunged at Austin. And as he did that, Austin swung and he hit Jeff right across the side of the head. But Jeff took the hit. He didn't fall down. He grabbed Austin by the collar and threw him as hard as he could to the ground. And Austin, he hit the pavement hard, face first. So Jeff is looking at this guy, kind of thinking he's not going to get up from that. But as he's assessing the situation, watching Austin start to stand back up again, Jeff suddenly feels a blinding pain in his face, in the side of his head, and his neck, on his back. He looks down, and he sees blood all over his arms. It's everywhere. He's covered in blood. It would turn out Austin was carrying a knife. And so when he had punched Jeff, that knife went into his face, it cut the side of his head, it cut his neck, and it cut his back. He had 5 different puncture points from that one single swing. And so Jeff believed in that moment that this was a potentially fatal wound. He was worried that perhaps his jugular had been struck and he was bleeding to death. And he's seeing Austin stand back up, coming right after him with this knife. And so Jeff decides their only chance is for him to run and call the police. And so he runs into Michelle's property. He's thinking that he's kind of drawing this guy towards him, away from Michelle. He runs into their property, kind of slams into all their doors. He goes out a back door, and then he loops around the property, and then he makes a run for it, straight across the street, back to his house. He never once turned around to see if this guy was after him. He just figured he was right behind him. He gets to his house, he runs inside, he locks the door, and then he calls 911. The operator asks if either of them are injured, and he says, yes, there's a girl laying on the ground, he beat her up, and then he says he ran over there, and he's bleeding profusely at the moment. The operator asks if he can tell if she's conscious, and he says no, it does not appear so, and that he's been stabbed in the back and is bleeding pretty bad. After the call is placed and Jeff is certain that help is on the way, he's barely conscious. But all he can remember thinking was, I hope this maniac Austin has abandoned his attack and just run off. Or I hope John has come outside and he's helping his wife. But unfortunately, all Jeff could hear was the sound of Austin across the street making these loud, animalistic grunting sounds. And at the same time, he hears the sound of someone screaming at the top of their lungs. He doesn't even know if it's one person or two people, if it's male or female. All he hears is screams and grunting sounds. And then, seconds later, the police show up. The following narrative is the account of the second responding officer, who we'll just call Dan. The first responding officer we'll just call Kristen. And so Dan, he comes flying down the street, he's got his sirens on, and he pulls in right behind Kristen's cop car, which is parked right out in front of John and Michelle's property. Kristen is already running up the driveway, her gun is out, and she's getting ready to engage somebody at the top of the driveway. So Dan, he hops out of his car, he's got his hand on his gun, and as he turns to run up the driveway, his view is obscured. There are two cars parked in the driveway, and so he can't see what's at the top of the driveway that Kristen is apparently getting ready to draw her gun on. But as he begins running up the driveway, he sees there is this massive 6-foot-wide stream of blood just coming down the driveway. So he goes around the left side of the left car, he goes up, and he sees Kristen right at the top of the driveway. She's got her gun aimed at the ground, right in front of the car. So he still can't see what's in front of the car yet. He comes bombing around the left side, right behind Kristen, and he looks down at what she's aiming her gun at. And he sees there's this man lying on the ground. His eyes are open. He's just laying there kind of stiff, and he's looking up at Kristen, he's looking up at Dan, and he's just quietly saying, "Please help me." The man on the ground was John Stevens. And on top of John Stevens was Austin. He was kind of laying sideways on John's chest. He had his left arm wrapped around John's neck to kind of hold him in place. And then he had his right arm, and he was doing something to John's face, but Dan couldn't really tell what he was doing. All he could take in was that there was clearly an aggressor, and they needed to get him off of the victim. But Kristen could not take the shot, because if she did, she ran the risk of firing the bullet through Austin and into John, killing John. So Dan tells Kristen, hold on, I'm going to tase him. And so he moves around Kristen to her left side, so he's positioned looking down at the back of Austin. He pulls out his taser. And right before he shoots his taser into Austin's back, he sees what Austin is doing to John's face with his free right hand. He was reaching into John's mouth and pulling his cheek out, kind of like a fishhook. He was pulling it out as far as he could, and then he was biting into John's cheek, and he was ripping out pieces of flesh and chewing and swallowing them. And from his position, Dan only saw this for a second, but he suddenly noticed, and Kristen, the other officer, would later confirm, there were all these chunks already missing from John's face. So Dan kind of snapped out of what he was seeing and fired his taser into the back of Austin. But it did nothing. It had absolutely no effect. Austin was entirely focused on biting John's face. That was all he was doing. He wasn't even registering that there were cops with their guns drawn on him. It was like they weren't even there. And so Dan runs back around Kristen to the other side of her. He's now on her right side, so he's standing right next to the car, looking down at Austin's front. He tells Kristen to kind of back up for a second, and then Dan winds up and kicks Austin square in the face, knocking his head off of John's face. But as soon as Austin's head comes off of John, he doesn't get up and try to fight with Dan. Instead, he just jumps back down, gets a deeper grip on John, and plunges his mouth back onto John's face. And so again, Dan winds up and boots Austin square in the face, knocking his head back. But again, he's totally unfazed. He doesn't want to attack the officers. He just wants to eat John's face. And so he goes right back down, gets a tighter grip, he goes back, and he starts chewing on John's face again. And so Dan was just repeatedly kicking him in the face over and over and over again. Right as this is happening, another set of officers showed up, and they had a canine. They had a dog. And so they come flying up, they kind of see the situation, and Dan tells them, release the dog. And so, sure enough, they release the canine. The canine clamps down on Austin's right arm, the arm that was fish hooking and kind of pulling John's face out. And the dog really got a good bite on his arm and yanked it away from John's face. But Austin just instantly ripped his arm back, doing severe damage to his own arm from the dog's teeth, and just repositioned himself and went back to biting John's face. And so the dog, just as it was trained, did another bite. It grabbed back onto Austin's arm, and it pulled it off of John's body. And so his arm is back like this again. And Austin, again, completely unfazed, just yanked his arm out of the dog's teeth again, shredding the muscles of his arm, and gets back in position and continues to eat John's face. And then finally, the dog gets another bite into Austin's arm. And this time, when the dog managed to yank Austin's arm away from John, Dan timed it, so he booted Austin square in the face right as his arm was being pulled back. And he hit him hard enough that Austin actually flew off of John and landed on his back. And as soon as he was on the ground, Dan actually leapt over John and landed on Austin's face, smashing his head into the cement, which kind of stunned him for a second. And as soon as he was stunned, Dan whipped out his handcuffs, threw it over one of Austin's wrists, and began pulling him by the handcuff up the driveway away from John. But as soon as he had some separation and Dan went to put the other handcuff on Austin, Austin began fighting back. And he looked up at Dan and he screamed, "Kill me! I'm eating humans! Kill me!" Dan didn't even know what to do. And so he's trying to put the other handcuff on him, and the whole time Austin is screaming, "Kill me! Kill me!" And so other officers had to run in, and then finally, after 3 other officers came over, they were able to hold Austin down long enough to get both handcuffs on him. After Austin was finally restrained, the officers checked on the victims. They checked on Michelle, who was in the garage, and unfortunately, she was deceased. She had died from blunt force trauma. And John, even though he had been alive when the police first showed up, he had succumbed to the multitude of injuries he had sustained, from stabbings to beatings to having a portion of his face ripped off. It's believed that after John came back from his walk, which would have been right after Jeff had been attacked, and ran back to his house, John saw Austin in his garage attacking his wife, and John ran in to try to save her. So ultimately, John would die trying to save the woman that he loved. Their dog would survive the attack, it was unharmed, and was given to one of their children to take care of. And Jeff Fisher, the neighbor who tried to save John and Michelle, he would survive the attack and make a full recovery. After Austin was finally handcuffed and was lying restrained on the driveway, he suddenly became unresponsive. He was rushed to the hospital, where it was determined that he had drank some poisonous chemicals, most likely from inside of John and Michelle's garage, and that was what was causing his organs to fail. Ultimately, Austin would go into a coma for 11 days from whatever he ingested. But the doctors were able to save his life, and so he would come out of that coma and he would make a full physical recovery. It was initially assumed that because of Austin's known drug abuse history, he must have been on some kind of powerful drug when he perpetrated this heinous crime. It was speculated that he could have been on bath salts or flakka, which are these synthetic hallucinogenic drugs, which are very powerful. And at the time, they were quite popular in Florida and had caused some other users to go on these kind of wild, violent rampages. And so it seemed to make a lot of sense that he must have been on one of those. But when Austin's toxicology report finally came back, it showed he only had a very small amount of THC in his system, which is the drug found in marijuana. And the other drugs that were in his system were all induced by the doctors and nurses at the hospital. Which meant at the time of this horrific attack, Austin was effectively sober. When the police asked Austin, "Why did you do this?" he initially said, "I don't remember. I don't know." But eventually, he would open up and he would tell this story that no sane person could possibly understand. He said that after he left that restaurant where his family was that third time, after he fought with his father and he stormed out, after that, he saw this dark figure outside with a white face. And he knew immediately that this figure was evil. And so, instinctively, Austin began running away from this evil figure. And so he ran for about 4 miles into John and Michelle's neighborhood. And when he got to this neighborhood, a neighborhood he was not familiar with, that he didn't intend to go to on purpose, he just kind of wound up there. He said he saw this brightly lit up garage, and he ran up into it, believing he could enlist the help of the people inside of this house, and that they would help him defeat this evil figure that was lurking somewhere nearby. And so he runs up into this garage, which happens to be John and Michelle's garage, and Michelle is in there. John is not. He's out for the walk with his dog. And Austin approaches her and tries to get her to help him. But he probably came off looking completely insane. And Michelle screamed. At which point, Austin said he believed Michelle was a witch. And so he pulled out his knife and he attacked her. And then after she fell to the ground, Austin said he drank a bottle of alcohol or something, which we now know was most likely very poisonous lawn chemicals that was just sitting in the garage. After he drinks that bottle, he turns around, and now he's looking out of the garage towards the street. And he said he saw this other figure in the doorway with a dog next to him. And then Austin said his mind just went blank. It's believed the figure he saw in the doorway was John Stevens returning from his walk. But we don't know for sure. And frankly, this story is pretty incoherent to begin with because it doesn't account for the fact that before John came back, Austin had been grappling with Jeff Fisher and stabbing Jeff Fisher, the neighbor. But Austin would say he has no recollection of encountering Jeff Fisher. He has no recollection of John or what he looked like. And he certainly doesn't remember biting John's face. And he had no memory of any interactions with police. He said that basically he turned around, he sees this figure, this dog, and then his mind went blank. And then he woke up about 2 weeks later in the hospital. Now, when his story went public, a lot of people just were not willing to accept that story. They said he was making it up so he could plead insanity at his trial and get a lesser sentence. But a world-renowned forensic psychologist named Dr. Philip Resnick, who had worked on many high-profile cases before, he did a lengthy assessment of Austin. And he came to a very different conclusion than the public. In his 3 8-page report, Resnick points out the fact that Austin continued to bite John's face even when he was being openly threatened with being shot by the police officer standing right over him. He continued to bite John's face after he was tased. He continued to bite John's face after he was kicked in the head repeatedly. He continued to bite John's face after a police dog repeatedly bit him. This all suggests that Austin was truly in a psychotic state when this attack occurred. A sane person, even under the influence of drugs, will retain a basic survival instinct. They will try to protect themselves. So when there are guns pointed at them, or they're being physically harmed, or there are threats of violence, they'll do things to protect themselves. But Austin didn't. It was like he had no idea about anything else in the world except John's face. Resnick specified that the type of psychotic episode that Austin was suffering from on the night of the attack is something called clinical lycanthropy delusions. Clinical lycanthropy is a very rare occurrence where an individual believes they are no longer human. And almost always what they believe they are is something akin to a werewolf. And in Austin's case, it's not that hard to figure out why you might reach that type of conclusion. He had told his sister earlier that day that he believed he was half horse. And then on a couple of other occasions, he had told his other friends that he believed he was half dog. And then, of course, on the night of the attack, after he killed Michelle, he pounced literally on John and began eating his face while making those loud animalistic grunting sounds. This is behavior that is certainly on par with what you would expect a werewolf to do in a movie, but this was not a movie. This was real life. After Austin came out of his coma, but before he had been transferred to jail, he agreed to do an interview with the clinical psychologist and TV personality Phil McGraw, better known as Dr. Phil. And during their 10-minute Zoom interview, Austin would break down and cry and say he was incredibly sorry to the family of the victims, that he didn't really know why it happened, and that clearly there was something wrong with him and he needed help. And he just hoped they could find it in their hearts to eventually forgive him. But it's unlikely the family of the victims are going to forgive him anytime soon. Especially when you consider they came out in an interview and said, "I hope Austin makes a full recovery from his coma, that he has no brain damage, that he is totally A-OK, so he can be fully aware and lucid when they read him his sentence." A sentence they hoped would be the death penalty. As of right now, though, the family of the victims will just have to keep on waiting, because Austin is still in jail awaiting trial. Thanks for watching. Cases like this are disturbing not just because of the violence, but because they force us to confront how terrifying the human mind can become when reality completely breaks apart. 2 innocent people lost their lives that night, a family was destroyed forever, and the questions surrounding what truly happened inside Austin Harrouff's mind still remain deeply unsettling to this day. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to check out our other true crime stories next. And as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Until next time.